Hey there, sleepy wanderer. Welcome back to Chronicles for Sleep, the only history channel where falling asleep in the middle is not only allowed, it's encouraged. If this is your first time here, grab a blanket, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and prepare yourself for a tale dipped in velvet, buried in secrets, and stitched together by one very moody nobleman. Tonight, we're not diving into battles or royal feasts. No. Tonight, we slip quietly into the estate of Lord Thorn Avonheart, a man so wealthy he owns 4 castles, 20 horses, and precisely one functioning emotion. The kind of man who drinks water from a goblet is worth more than your rent and still looks like the world owes him a better sunrise. But when a barefoot girl appears at his gate with a letter from the past, things start to unravel faster than his velvet cuffs in the rain. Before we continue, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It's the noble thing to do, and it helps us keep making stories that blend history, mystery, and mild emotional damage. Every subscription is one less reason for me to start narrating medieval tax codes instead. And trust me, no one wants that. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Is it snowing outside, raining, or are you listening from a bed that doesn't smell like a goat? I read them all, and yes, I judge very gently. Also, make sure you hit that bell because tomorrow's tale might include a cursed mirror, a forgotten king, or a haunted soup spoon. Only one of those is fake. Now, back to Lord Thorn, who just found out the past doesn't stay buried, especially when you've got a tree in your backyard that remembers everything. In the heart of Eldoria, where the forest whispered gossip to the wind and even the rivers looked like they were hiding something, a manor stood so grand it made other mansions feel like badly folded tents. This was the home of Lord Thorn Avonheart, a man who could buy your village, sell it back to you at double the price, and then charge you interest for the conversation. He was rich. The rich made other lords say, "Yes, my lord," even when no one was talking to them. Thorn Avonheart was also awake, not because he needed to be, not because of urgent state affairs, invading armies, or a goose in the pantry. No, he was awake because his body had forgotten how to sleep in. Waking before the sun wasn't a duty. It was just the curse of a man who had at some point believed discipline was noble. That belief had died, along with his enthusiasm for morning feasts and casual trust in people. But the habit remained. He rose from his bed, not a bed, but a silk-draped altar to insomnia. He sat up without a sound, eyes adjusting not to the darkness but to the weight of memory. The bedclothes slid off him like expensive regrets. He stood slowly, not because he was old, but because his moving fast implied urgency, and Thorn was allergic to that. Despite the fire in the hearth, his chambers were colder than they should have been. Fires always tried, but stone walls remembered winter like a grudge. Thorn dressed himself in layers of velvet, wool, and a hint of disappointment. He could have summoned a valet, but then he would have had to say things like, "Good morning," or "Thank you." That felt entirely too cheerful for a man who had once stared down a tax rebellion without blinking. Each layer he added felt like armor, soft, expensive armor sewn by hands, paid to be invisible. His boots, polished to a sinful shine, made no sound on the stone floor. He moved like a ghost with property rights. The manor was still. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the distant creak of ancient beams complaining about the weight of time. Down in the dining hall, breakfast awaited. Not a feast. Thorn didn't believe in indulgent mornings. A thin slice of bread so pale it looked like it feared the toaster, a few winter berries pretending to be sweet, and water in a silver goblet that probably cost more than an entire village wedding. Water, not wine. Thorn drank only when diplomacy required it, or when memory did. He tapped a finger on the table as he stared through tall windows at the land sprawling beyond. Fog still clung to the fields like a lazy houseguest. In the distance, workers had begun to move, figures bent low, tools in hand, shoulders already bearing the weight of survival. They were part of his estate, legacy, revenue stream, and yet not quite real to him. They lived in a different tempo, a different script. Sometimes he envied them, other times he forgot they existed. Thorn had known many kinds of silence in his life. This one, the breakfast silence, was the most truthful. It said, "Here is a man who owns everything and speaks to no one." But that morning, something changed. A ripple in the still water. He noticed it first as motion at the edge of his vision. A small figure, alone, moving along the gravel path that wound through the estate like a forgotten vein. Barefoot, unaccompanied, uninvited. She was young, maybe 16, maybe ageless in that strange way hardship makes a person blur. Her shawl was threadbare. Her feet were caked in mud that remembered rivers and refused to leave quietly. And in her hand, a parchment clutched so tightly it had begun to fray. Thorn did not rise. He did not speak, but his brow arched in mild curiosity. A servant, sensing something unusual, hovered nearby. Thorn gave the smallest of nods. The girl was allowed entry. She walked with the strange confidence of someone who either didn't know who he was or didn't care. When she stopped before him, she did not bow. She did not tremble. She extended the parchment as if handing over something that had grown too heavy. He took it, slowly, studying her face. She had freckles, not the gentle kind poets write about, but the kind left by relentless sun and hard days. Her eyes were dark, not with fear, but with boredom. It was as if this meeting was already taking too long. There was no seal, no crest, no scent of perfume. Just a line of ink, hurried and brutal. You remember what you buried, I remember where. Thorn did not blink, he did not gasp, but something behind his ribs tightened like a belt pulled one notch too far. He did not reread it. He didn't need to. The words were carved deep, deeper than any title or oath. When he looked up, she was already gone, vanished down the gravel path, past confused guards, silent dogs, and a world that didn't realize something had just shifted. He sat in that silence for a long time. The parchment lay in his hand like a heartbeat. The fireplace crackled. A berry rolled off his plate and died a soft, fruity death on the floor. Thorn Avonheart, Lord of Stonevale, Warden of the Southern Grove, Keeper of 3 Rivers, and one regret, did not move. Because somewhere beneath his estate, beneath the root of an old yew tree, beneath 20 years of forgetting, something waited, and it had just sent a messenger with muddy feet and nothing left to lose. Lord Thorn Avonheart did not move for a long time. The letter remained pressed between his fingers like it might bleed if squeezed harder. Outside, the morning advanced, softening into light, but inside the manor, time hesitated. His breath was shallow, not out of fear. He had stared down blades, betrayals, and bureaucracy, but out of something older, something colder. Recognition. The words on that parchment weren't a threat. No, threats were loud and clumsy. This was something worse, a reminder. A memory slipped under the door like smoke. And Thorn knew, without a doubt, that whoever sent it knew him. Not his titles, not his estate. Him. The boy before the Lord, the man before the mask. He rose from the table slowly. The goblet of water remained untouched. His steward entered the hall, startled by Thorn standing so stiffly like a statue caught mid-repentance. "Shall I fetch the hounds for your morning ride, my lord?" Thorn didn't answer. He didn't even blink. Instead, he walked past the steward, out through the side corridor, and into the back hall that led to the old armory. He did not need a ride. He needed a map. Not one of trade routes or estate boundaries, but one of memory. One that hadn't been touched in years. The map room smelled of dust and forgotten things. He pulled open a drawer lined with brittle parchment, ink so faded it looked like ghosts had tried to write, and gave up halfway. And there, under a stack of war plans from a rebellion no one remembered, it lay, the estate's original topographic survey, drawn decades before the orchards, the granaries, and the titles stacked like bricks on his name. His fingers hovered over the map like he expected it to bite. He unrolled it slowly on the long oak table. Near the southern boundary, nestled between 2 hills and a stretch of marsh, was a faded red mark, a circle, a mistake, a memory. He had drawn it himself, just once. Then it was buried under soil and silence. It had been 20 years, 2 decades of pretending that part of his life never happened. He had ensured no laborers were sent to that corner of the estate. Too rocky, he told them, unfit for farming. No one questioned it. No one ever did. But he knew the real reason. He couldn't bear the sound of shovels digging too close to what he'd left behind. He closed the map and rolled it tight. There was no time to waste. He left the manor through the servant's door, bypassing the stables. He didn't saddle a horse. This path was not meant to be ridden. This was a walk for penance, not for pride. The southern path had once been a game trail. Now it was little more than tangled undergrowth and thorns. Birds scattered at his approach. Brambles clawed at his sleeves like they remembered him and weren't ready to forgive. Each step deeper into the woods felt like sinking into a past he'd buried alive. The yew tree waited. It stood exactly where it always had, gnarled and twisted, roots like knotted fingers gripping the earth. Nothing else had grown near it. It was as if even the forest knew this was no ordinary tree. This was a witness, and perhaps a tomb. Thorn stood beneath its limbs, a heart pounding against his ribs like a fist on a locked door. He reached out and almost touched the bark, but stopped. Instead, he knelt. Slowly, painfully. It had been years since he allowed his knees to feel dirt. "You remember what you buried. I remember where." The words echoed in his skull like a drumbeat. He lowered his hand to the tree's base, brushing aside decades of moss, leaves, and lies. The earth felt soft here, disturbed. He hadn't dared return. Not once. And now, someone had. Someone who knew where to find the one thing he thought he had hidden perfectly. The truth. His mind flooded with the image of her. Leora of Ashmere, no title, no family name, just eyes like storms and a voice that never learned fear. She was the beginning of the fracture in his carefully built self. The laughter that didn't ask permission, the dirt under his nails he had once considered poetry, and the choice he made that night under this tree. He should have run with her. He didn't. Instead, he watched her leave, or perhaps be taken. The details were smudged now, warped by time and guilt, but he remembered the sound she made when the guards seized her. Not a scream, not a plea, just a sharp breath like a page being torn. And afterward, when the world returned to its cold routines, Thorn buried what was left, her scarf, her book, maybe a promise, maybe it's a sin. He never looked back, until now. He reached into the soil, fingers clawing like roots of their own, pulling up clumps of wet earth. The wind picked up as if the forest was holding its breath. And then his fingers touched something. Fabric, rotten, threadbare. Still here, he pulled it free, a corner of blue wool wrapped around a rusted object. Metal, a locket, a brooch. He wiped it clean, and there it was, the pendant she wore. It hadn't rusted through, it had survived, like the memory, like the accusation. Thorn stood slowly, pendant in hand. His palm trembled. He was not alone. A figure stood at the tree line, watching, small, silent, familiar. The girl, the messenger. She didn't move. Neither did he. Then she turned and disappeared back into the woods like she was never meant to stay. Like her task was done. Thorn looked down at the pendant, the symbol of a life he once dared to imagine, and felt the weight of 2 decades crash into him like a wave. The past had not just returned, it had been waiting, and now he would have to follow where it led. Lord Thorn did not return to the manor that night. The woods closed behind him like a secret. Shadows slipped between branches. Every sound, the rustle of a squirrel, the whisper of a breeze, felt like breath on the back of his neck. He walked, not toward home, but deeper into the land he owned, yet hadn't dared to tread in years. He clutched the pendant like a compass, though he had no direction. Not yet. By the time the moon crowned the treetops, Thorn had reached the edge of the marshland, the one place even his bravest tenants avoided. Fog hung low like a body with no bones. The air smelled of decay and wet roots. But he wasn't here for comfort. He was chasing a ghost that had finally turned to face him. He stopped near a crooked stone, half swallowed by moss. Years ago, there had been a hut here, a modest one, built of timber and thatch. He had paid for it quietly through a false name, so Leora could have a place to live, write, and be free of the eyes and rules of court life. Now, the structure was gone and burned, from the looks of it. Only the stone chimney remained, like a throat that never got to speak. Thorn knelt by the ashes long since cooled. He didn't remember ordering it destroyed. That part hurt more than he expected. Something cracked behind him. A twig, a boot. He stood fast, hand already on the dagger he barely remembered strapping to his side. But when he turned, there was no threat, just an older man hunched, wearing rags and time. "You came back," the man croaked. Thorn narrowed his eyes. "Do I know you?" "No," the old man replied, "but I knew her." That was enough. Thorn relaxed, though barely. "Leora?" The man nodded slowly, stepping closer. "She lived here, until she didn't." "Who burned it?" Thorn asked, voice tight. "Does it matter?" The older man sat on a nearby stump. "She was gone before the fire. That was just cleanup." That word, cleanup, landed like a slap. "She left willingly," Thorn said, though it sounded more like a question. "She left believing you'd follow," the old man replied, not unkindly. "She waited 2 nights. After that, she stopped waiting." The silence stretched. What happened to her? The man didn't answer right away. He stared into the fog like it might give up its secrets. Depends on which rumor you want to believe. She went north. She married a merchant. She joined a monastery. She died in childbirth. She became a ghost. I want the truth. Do you? Thorn's jaw clenched. If you know anything, the man lifted a hand. She came back once, years later. She stood under that tree, the same one you just came from, and she wept. Not for you, not for herself, for the choice neither of you made. Thorn closed his eyes. She left something there, the man continued. A letter, buried it beneath the roots. I didn't find a letter. Then dig deeper. The older man stood, creaking like bark. One more thing. The girl who brought your letter, she's not from around here. She doesn't talk to anyone, shows up when it's time. What time? The man smiled, sad and toothless. Time to decide if you're still the boy who ran or the man who finally stops running. He walked into the fog and did not return. Thorn stood alone again, pendant in one hand, questions in the other. He did not sleep that night. He stayed by the ruin of the hut, left waiting for dawn. He returned to the yew when the light returned, weak and winter gray. This time he dug with both hands, deeper, through clay and rot, through roots that clung like old guilt. And there, wrapped in waxed cloth, sealed in oilskin, he found a bundle. Inside, a letter and a journal. Her journal. Leora's handwriting, sharp, slanted, defiant, leaped from the pages. She had written of their meetings, their laughter, the stupid jokes he made. She wrote of the first time he touched her hand as if it might have burned him. Of the last time he turned away, choosing legacy over love. She had forgiven him, but she had not forgotten. The letter, though, that was meant for him. It read, Thorn, if you're reading this, then either you've grown braver or something scarier than the past came knocking. I hope it's the former. I hope you came of your own will, not because guilt dragged you like a chain. I left because you stayed. I stayed away because I thought you'd made your choice. But the thing about choices is that we make them once, but we live with them every day. If you want to find me, don't follow the maps. Follow what's left of your heart. If there's anything worth saving, it will guide you better than any road. If not, then bury this again. Let it rest. Let me rest. Leora Thorn didn't cry, but he didn't blink for a very long time. He folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and breathed. Then he stood, not just to leave, but to act. He returned to the manor by noon. His steward nearly fainted at the sight of his mud-caked boots and bruised hands. Prepare a horse, Thorn said. For where, my lord? Thorn looked out the window toward the horizon. North. The messenger girl never reappeared. But Thorn had already begun rewriting his map, not with ink, with intent. The morning Thorn Avonheart left Stonevale, no fanfare announced his departure. No banners, trumpets, or even a bewildered steward running after him with a forgotten hat. Just the creak of saddle leather, the crunch of hooves on frostbitten earth, and the echo of a decision 20 years overdue. He didn't ride with servants. He didn't send word ahead. This journey was personal, the kind that gnaws at your ribs until you move or rot. He carried little. A change of clothes, a blade he hadn't used since the Northern Rebellion, and Leora's pendant tucked close to his chest. Every beat of his heart nudged it gently like it reminded him to hurry up. The road to Ashmere stretched wide and long, framed by skeletal trees and fields that had forgotten the color green. Winter was coming fast, but not fast enough to stop him. Thorn had no clear destination, only a name. Ashmere. A place whispered in old stories and trade routes, once a minor village known for its dye works, and a chapel that claimed to house the thumbone of St. Verin. He remembered passing through it once, long ago, when he was young enough to believe in peace and foolish enough to think it would wait for him. Days passed. The sky never quite cleared. Rain came in fits, like the heavens were undecided on whether to cleanse or punish. Thorn rode through towns that didn't recognize his face, only the coin he tossed at innkeepers. He didn't sleep well. Nightmares came in flashes, Leora's face, the yew tree, fire licking the sky, and always, always, the girl in the shawl watching from a distance she never closed. On the fifth morning, he found Ashmere. It wasn't on any map now. Not anymore. What was once a town had become a skeleton. Half-burned homes, collapsed roofs, and roads choked with vines. It had been abandoned for years. He dismounted, boots squelching into the mud, and strolled through the wreckage. The dye house was a shell, The chapel, a crumbled frame. The thumb bone of St. Veron is not fireproof, but amid the ruin there was something else. A trail. It wasn't marked by signs or stones, but by deliberate absence. Weeds bent the wrong way, a boot print where no one should have walked. He followed it through a half-collapsed fence and into the woods. His instincts, long dulled by diplomacy and estate dinners, buzzed to life. She had been here. The trail led to a clearing bordered by ancient stones, half-sunk in moss. At its center stood a cottage, intact, not new, but lived in. Smoke rose from the chimney, chickens pecked near the door, and seated beneath the bare branches of an ash tree was a woman with silver-threaded hair, sewing something in her lap. He knew it was her before she looked up. Leora, she saw him, paused, then went back to sewing. Thorn stepped closer. "You're hard to find." She didn't look up. "You were never supposed to look." Silence clung between them like fog. "You sent the letter," he said. She shook her head. "No, I buried the truth. Someone else chose to dig it up." He swallowed. "Then why now?" Leora set down the needle. "Because I wanted to know if you'd still come, if you could still follow something not written in a ledger." Thorn sat slowly on a stone across from her. His knees creaked, and not just from age. "I thought you were dead." "I thought you were a coward," she replied flatly. "We're both wrong." He let that sit. It felt fair. The wind stirred, a branch snapped in the distance, some animals shuffled past the brush, but neither of them flinched. "I found the journal," he said, "the letter." "I meant it," she replied, "every word. I also meant to disappear, but time can drag things back, doesn't it?" Thorn looked around. "You rebuilt." "I survived. There's a difference." "And you live here, alone?" She nodded. "Safer that way. For everyone." "From what?" She met his eyes for the first time. "From who I was, who I became, after you left." Guilt tasted like iron on his tongue. He shifted and felt the pendant against his ribs. "I brought this," he said, pulling it free. "It still works." Leora took it gently. Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment the ears cracked. Not enough to fall through, but enough to ache. "You kept it?" "It was the only thing I didn't bury." She looked at him then, not the lord or man, but the boy she had once almost believed in. "I don't need you to apologize," she said softly. "I'm not sure I know how," he admitted. They sat in the silence of what might have been. And for a moment, neither past nor future pressed too hard. Then, the girl stepped out of the woods, the same one. Shawl wrapped tight, eyes unreadable. Leora saw her. "You again." The girl said nothing, just held out another letter. This one bore a seal, a royal one. Thorn took it, broke the wax, and read. His face darkened. "What is it?" Leora asked. "They know I left," he replied. "They know why, and they want it buried again." She stood. "Then they're afraid," he nodded. "They should be." The girl turned and walked away. Leora didn't ask who she was. Maybe she already knew. Thorn folded the letter and pocketed it. "Will you come with me?" Leora hesitated. Then, "No, but I'll walk you to the edge." They left together, not as lovers, not as enemies, as two people finally on the same page, and behind them the ash tree swayed, not in farewell, but in a warning. They reached the edge of the woods as the light began to fade. Leora silently walked beside Thorn, each step pressing fallen leaves deeper into the frozen mud. Neither spoke of what came next, though both knew it was no longer just about the past. Something was stirring in the cracks, and whatever power had sent that sealed letter wasn't just aware, it was watching. When they reached the clearing, Leora stopped. The road beyond stretched toward the low hills where Ashmere used to stand, proud, and farther still to the cities that hummed with politics and rot. "This is where I stop," she said. Thorn didn't argue. He only nodded slowly. "I don't forgive you," she added, "but I also don't need to hate you anymore." "That's more mercy than I deserve," he replied. Leora turned back toward her cottage, and Thorn mounted his horse without another word. But as he rode away, he glanced over his shoulder. She hadn't looked back. The journey back to Stonevale was colder than the ride out. It could be the season. Maybe it was what he carried now, more than a pendant or a letter. He carried intention. It's a dangerous thing for a man with power. The royal seal had been stamped in crimson wax, bearing the unmistakable crest of House Caerwyn, the ruling line. No threats were spoken within the letter, but every word trembled with warning. A quiet demand that he return, that he does not dig further. The matter of Ashmere, of Leora, of what had been buried both in soil and memory, remains so. They hadn't said the words outright, but he knew a veiled order when he read one. He arrived at Stonevale 3 days later. The manor had not changed. The servants greeted him with well-practiced concern, the steward fumbling over apologies for the state of the West Wing renovations. Thorn waved them off. He needed no comforts. He went straight to the study, locked the door, unfolded the royal letter again, laying it beside Leora's journal and the pendant. Symbols of a crossroads. One born of duty, the other of loss. He didn't sleep. He read through Leora's journal aloud as if the walls might finally hear what they'd missed. Her words painted him with honesty, not cruelty. She wrote of their youth and how she never trusted nobles, especially those with soft hands and sharper minds. But she had tried, and he had failed. By dawn, he had decided. He summoned his steward. "I need the name of every magistrate still loyal to the old crown," Thorn said. "My lord," the man blinked, "and every priest who remembers Ashmere, quietly." The steward bowed and left, clearly rattled. Thorn turned to his window. Snow was starting to fall. Good. Let it cover the road for now. Let it keep the curious away. What he planned to uncover couldn't stay in shadow much longer. He started writing that afternoon. Not one letter, but dozens. To allies, to enemies, to people who owed him favors, and to those who owed him nothing but suspicion. Each message was a spark, and by nightfall, Stonevale had become a flint box. That evening, a rider arrived from the capital. Not a messenger. A knight. Sir Eric Windfall. He was younger than Thorn, but his armor bore the same seal as the letter. He removed his helmet in the great hall and bowed low. "My Lord Avonheart," he said, "you've been summoned." "I'm aware," Thorn said. "The king wishes this matter to remain undisturbed." "Then he shouldn't have disturbed me." Eric straightened. "You refuse?" "I reconsider," Thorn replied, voice cold. "But only after I've spoken with him, in person." The knight hesitated, then nodded once. "Then you'll ride with me tomorrow, at dawn." "Very well," Thorn said. "Have you eaten?" "I'm not here to dine, my lord." "Neither am I," muttered he. That night, he slept little. He burned the old maps, except one, the one with the red circle by the U. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his cloak. Before dawn, he visited the crypt, not to pray, to remember. His father's tomb was covered in frost. The inscription had faded, but Thorn knew it by heart. "Legacy is not stone. It is a shadow. It follows you, shapes you, drowns you if you let it." He touched the cold marble, then turned away. At sunrise, he mounted his horse beside Sir Eric. The road to the capital was long, but Thorn no longer rode in circles. He rode to confront, to confess, and if needed, to burn the lies from the root. He didn't know that back in Ashmere's ruins, a second knight had arrived, days behind the first. His armor bore no crest. His blade was clean, but his orders were not. He moved through the wreckage without stopping and studied the ashes of the dye house, the flattened stone where the chapel once stood. Then he knelt where Leora's cottage had stood and pressed his hand to the earth. He whispered something too soft to carry. When he rose, he did not head toward the road. He moved back into the woods, toward the clearing, toward the ash tree. Something had been found there, and something else had been left behind. The crown wanted silence, yes, but not everyone served the same master. In Stonevale, Thorn stood by the window, unaware. He was preparing for a political reckoning, but someone else was preparing for war. The road to the capital was not a simple path through the hills. It was a return to a world Thorn had once dominated, a world of whispered alliances, veiled threats, and silk-covered daggers. He silently rode beside Sir Eric, snowflakes catching in their horses' manes and melting against his cloak. It felt like riding into a storm waiting 20 years to break. The capital city, Caerwyn Hold, emerged from the mist like a beast of stone and fire. Its spires loomed overhead, the cat carved with the faces of kings who smiled like they remembered every betrayal. Thorn felt their eyes on him as he passed under the archways, a returning sun or a wandering ghost. He wasn't sure which. They arrived at the palace by mid-morning. Word of his arrival had traveled ahead because the guards did not question his presence. They parted with stiff formality, bowing just low enough to be polite without hiding their contempt. Thorn noticed. He always noticed. Sir Eric escorted him to the eastern wing, a part of the palace Thorn knew all too well. It had once been the council chamber wing. Now it was quieter and more ceremonial, the power having migrated elsewhere. Still, it was full of eyes. At the chamber doors, Eric stopped. You'll be received by the royal arbiter first, he said. Of course, Thorn replied. No monarch ever dirties their hands with first questions. Eric flinched slightly. He wasn't used to the old games. The doors opened. The arbiter was already seated at a high table, flanked by scribes with ink-stained fingers and expressions like rotting fruit. Her name was Marilyn Vere. She had once been a poet. Now, she wrote verdicts. Lord Avonheart, she said without rising, you have stirred ghosts. Thorn inclined his head. Better ghosts than liars. A flicker of amusement touched her lips. We hear you've been asking about Ashmere, about events we all agreed never happened. I don't recall agreeing, Thorn said. No, Marilyn replied, but your silence was interpreted generously. Thorn stepped forward. What happened in Ashmere was a state crime dressed in the garb of religious sanction. It was not justice, it was erasure. Marilyn waved a hand. Spare me the dramatics. You're here now. What do you want? I want the king, he said. I want to speak of what he ordered and what comes next. Marilyn leaned back, tapping a finger on the armrest. And if he denies ever knowing about it? Thorn didn't hesitate. Then I'll find someone who remembers, someone outside these walls. A long pause. Then she said, You're not the only one who's digging. We sent someone to Ashmere, someone who doesn't ask twice. Thorn's heart dropped. Leora? She wasn't named, Marilyn said, but I doubt your conscience will be comforted by that. He turned to leave. Then this isn't a council, it's a funeral. Before Marilyn could respond, the chamber doors opened again. A voice boomed from behind. Let him pass. It was the king. King Aldrin Kerwin, once Thorn's ally, is now a man older, thinner, and sharper. He wore the crown like it was welded to his skull. Come, Thorn, he said. Let's speak plainly. They moved into the private solar, leaving Marilyn behind with her scribes. The solar was warm, deceptively calm. A fire burned in the hearth. The king poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one over. You were always better with fire than frost, Aldrin said. Thorn didn't drink. You sent someone to finish what we buried. I sent someone to keep the realm intact, Aldrin replied. Ashmere was a wound. You want to open it again. For what? Justice? Closure? You know we don't get those. She deserves more than silence. She's alive? Thorn's eyes narrowed. Don't play dumb. You knew she was. That's why you sent the knight. I sent a shadow, Aldrin admitted. Virgil, I didn't expect you to follow it. Then you underestimated what guilt can carry. Aldrin downed his wine. The past doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to the people who survive it, and sometimes they don't want it returned. Then why silence her? The king stood, because revolutions are fed by memory, and Ashmere, my dear Thorn, is a feast. Silence. Thick. Then, will you stop me? Thorn asked. No, Aldrin replied, but I won't protect you either. Thorn turned to leave. Stonevale will burn if this grows, Aldrin said behind him, and I won't stop the flames. Thorn didn't turn around. Then I'll burn with it, but I won't burn alone. He left the palace as quietly as he had come, but this time the embers followed, and across the kingdom those who had forgotten began to remember. Thorn left the capital as dawn cracked the horizon in fractured gold. He rode hard, faster than a man of his age should, and certainly faster than the king had expected. Behind him, the palace receded like a memory he had no time to grieve. There was no celebration, no victory march. Only the sound of hooves over stone and the faint pressure of a reckoning, pressing down like a storm cloud. He didn't know what he expected to find in Stonevale, but it wasn't what greeted him. The manor gates were open, the steward gone. Guards are missing from posts, and smoke, rising behind the west wing like a warning. Thorn dismounted before the horse fully stopped. He ran, his legs old but fueled by fear. The courtyard was littered with ash and broken banners. Inside, chaos had bloomed. Tapestries were torn, doors were ajar, and the heavy silence of a place had been recently violated. He moved through the wreckage, past his study, where papers still fluttered from a shattered window, and into the hall where the smell of blood stopped him cold. It wasn't a battle, it was a message. Something, or someone, had come here looking for something they believed he hid, or someone they feared he'd protect. Leora, he whispered. A sound behind him made him turn. Sir Eric stumbled into view, armor scorched and blade chipped. He looked half dead, breathing hard, one arm limp. They came at night, Eric gasped. No crest, no standard, just black cloaks and steel, like ghosts. Thorn steadied him. Who led them? Eric shook his head. I didn't see, But they knew what to burn. They hit the archives, the letters, the ledger room. Not thieves, then. Erasure agents. "Help me upstairs," Eric muttered. Thorn led him to the solar. There, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a second copy of Leora's journal, one he hadn't told even the steward about. He handed it to Eric. "If I fall, you deliver this to the council at Ellendor, the quiet court, the ones who still remember what truth feels like." Eric nodded. "What about you?" "I'm going to find her." "Where?" Thorn stared out the cracked window. "Where the shadow moves before the fire." That night, he rode again. No longer toward power, but away from it, toward whatever was left of the truth and the woman who refused to stay buried by time. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Leora had already moved. She had seen the black smoke from her hill, and she hadn't waited. She left the cottage before dusk, taking nothing but a small satchel, a dagger, and the knowledge that silence no longer protected her. She moved like she had 20 years ago, quick, focused, and angry. The forest closed around her as she headed south toward the ridge where the old border stones still stood. They marked the edge of the king's realm and the beginning of something older, lands not claimed by politics, but by myth. Lands where no knight followed, except one. The second knight, the one without a crest, moved in silence through those same woods. His orders had been clear: recover the journal, confirm her presence, and eliminate the threat. But something in the orders hadn't sat right. It was too clean, too final, like a door closing before he'd seen the room. So he followed, not because he was loyal, but because he was curious. And curious men are dangerous when they carry swords. At Stonevale, Eric recovered slowly. The servants who had fled began returning under cover of night. They brought stories of villages threatened, of soldiers who wore no badge but spoke with the authority of kings, of names whispered and erased from records. Thorn listened. He built a list. Then he sent riders, not with weapons, but with copies. Copies of Leora's letter, of the journal entries, of the map with the red circle. He scattered the truth like seeds, daring the crown to dig them all up before they bloomed. In the capital, Marilyn Veer received a copy. She didn't burn it. She read it twice, poured a drink, and stared out her tower window for a long time. The king didn't know she'd seen it. He would, soon enough. Thorn reached the border ridge at twilight. The forest here was thicker, older, hungrier. He tied off his horse and moved on foot, guided by instinct and memory. And there she was. Leora stood by the stone marker, blade drawn, breath calm. She didn't flinch when he approached. "They burned your house," he said. "I saw," she replied. "They sent knights." "I know." "I think they'll send more." She turned to face him. "Then let them. We don't hide anymore." Behind them, the wind picked up, cold and sharp. Somewhere deep in the trees, metal scraped metal. The second night had arrived, and this time, he wasn't alone. The forest near the border was not a place of comfort. It was thick with pine and memory, steeped in old soil that had absorbed too many whispers and too much blood. In the silence between steps, it felt as though even the trees were listening. And now, they had an audience. Leora held her ground near the old stone marker. Her dagger was small, but her stance was not. She stood like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The wind tugged at her cloak, revealing the long braid over her shoulder, streaked with the silver of hard seasons. Thorn stepped beside her. His sword was sheathed, but his presence was armed. He wasn't sure what they were waiting for, but he knew something waited with them. Something was coming down the path that could no longer be turned back. "I saw him," Leora said without looking. "The knight, the one without a banner." "He's close," Thorn replied. "Closer than we want." She nodded. "Then we stop running." And they did. They didn't retreat into the woods. They didn't hide. Instead, they started a fire, not a signal, but a statement. Let them come. Let the ones who erased, who silenced, who burned and buried find something still standing. Night fell fast. The flames flickered orange against the pale bark of the trees, throwing long shadows across the earth. And then, without ceremony, he arrived. The knight stepped from the dark like a blade from a sheath. His armor was matte black, no crest, no color. A helmet obscured his face, but his presence spoke for him. Calm, lethal, unhurried, he did not draw his weapon. Thorn stepped forward. "State your purpose." The knight's voice was gravel. "I don't speak for kings." Leora's grip tightened on her dagger. "Then speak for yourself." The knight paused, then slowly removed his helmet. He was young, no older than 30, but his eyes held no youth, only orders carried out too many times. "I came to kill you," he said, looking at Leora. "That was the mission." "But," Thorn pressed, "but the mission lied." He tossed the helmet to the ground. "They told me Ashmere was a threat, that what she carried would fracture the realm, that her story was poison." "And now?" Leora asked. "I read the journal," he said. Thorn's breath caught. "You have it?" "No, I read the copy," sighed. "One of the letters you sent made it to an archivist in Dunford. I intercepted it. I read it." Silence. "I was raised by the crown," the knight said, "trained by its generals, taught that loyalty was the highest truth, but truth." He looked at the fire. "Truth doesn't need armor, it just needs to be spoken." Leora slowly lowered her dagger. "So why are you here?" The knight looked up. "To change sides." The fire cracked. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. His name was Kale. He didn't apologize for what he'd done, because apologies, he said, didn't bring back what had been lost, but he promised to help protect what was left. And there wasn't much time. "They'll send others," Kale said. "The next ones won't read. They'll only kill." Thorn nodded. "Then we don't wait." That night, the three of them mapped the forest. They found the old trails, the forgotten clearings, the ravine that once held the rebel camps. Thorn knew the land. Leora knew how to vanish in it, and Kale knew how to weaponize it. By dawn, the first traps were set. They weren't planning a war. They were buying time. Enough for the letters to reach farther, enough for someone in power to hesitate. Back in Stonevale, Eric had recovered enough to walk. He read Leora's journal again, and this time he didn't stop halfway. He didn't flinch. And when he finished, he wrote a letter of his own, to Marilyn. He told her everything, and he signed his name. In the capital, Marilyn read the letter in silence. Then she lit a candle, not to burn it, but to read it again by flame. The next morning, she did something no one expected. She resigned. She walked into the great court, handed the king her seal, and said nothing. The silence roared louder than any rebellion. King Aldrin received the news with fury. But fury without control is just noise. And Aldrin's power was built on silence, not strength. Across the kingdom, people started asking questions. About Ashmere, about the fire, about a woman who refused to vanish, about a man who came back when he didn't have to, and about a knight who put down his sword. In the forest, Leora stood at the edge of the ravine, watching the fog roll in. "They're coming," Kale said. Thorn stepped beside them. "Then let's give them a welcome they'll never forget." The flame was lit. Not for war, for memory, for truth. And this time, it wouldn't go out. The fog settled low over the ravine like a warning. It slipped between the trees, curled around rocks, and hung in the air with the weight of things unsaid. Thorn, Leora, and Kale stood just beyond its reach, listening. Every sound felt amplified, every bird call a signal, every breeze a breath before something broke. They had lit the flame the night before, not just a fire, but a flare. A sign, a dare, a truth refusing to die quietly. And now they waited for the answer. Kale crouched near the trapline, fingers brushing the ground. "Hoof prints," he said. "Dozens." Leora didn't move. "How far? 3 miles. Maybe less. They're splitting into groups," Thorn nodded. "Tactical sweep." "They've done this before," Kale muttered. "So have we," Leora replied. The three of them moved quickly, silent as wind through pine. The traps they'd set were crude, tripwires, false trails, pit covers, but they were distractions, not solutions. What mattered was time and truth. And the message that someone, somewhere, still resisted. By midday, they heard the first voice, a soldier, shouting commands in clipped tone, then the sound of metal striking metal. Not a fight, a signal. Kale looked to Thorn. "They're organized. Someone higher up is here." Thorn's jaw tightened. "Then we aim higher." He turned to Leora. "You know the Hollow Ridge?" She nodded. "I hid there during the rebellion." "Good. Set up there. Make them chase you. I'll circle south." Kale hesitated. "And me?" Thorn looked at him. "Follow your instincts." Kale gave a sharp nod, then melted into the trees. The hunt began. It wasn't a battle, not yet, but it felt like one. Shadows darted through the underbrush, steel flashed in the sun, and the air buzzed with tension too old to be new. Thorn moved fast and low, leading one patrol away from the main group. He didn't fight. He didn't stop. He led them deeper, into the maze. Leora from the ridge sent up smoke. She didn't run. She walked calmly across the slope in full view. A taunt, a test. It worked. 2 riders broke from the main path, charging toward her. But their path was false. A slide of rock and broken branch, just enough to look solid until it wasn't. Their horses went down. Leora didn't look back. In the south, Cale did not run. He waited. A unit of 5 approached, cautious but confident. Cale stepped out with his sword drawn, not raised but held low. "I was like you," he said. They hesitated. "I believed what they told me, that silence was order, that fire was rebellion." No one moved, but silence buried the truth. And the fire, it's the only light left. The leader raised his blade. Cale sighed. "So be it." The fight was brutal, efficient. 3 fell, 1 flun surrendered. Cale spared him. "Run. Tell them we don't vanish. We burn." At the ridge, Leora had vanished into the caves, narrow slits in the stone only locals knew. Inside, she found old weapons. Rusted, forgotten, but still sharp. She left one at the entrance. A message. In the center of the ravine, Thorn met the commander. Not a soldier, a noble. Lady Cyril Vance, armor trimmed in silver, eyes like winter. "Lord Avonheart," she said, "still chasing ghosts?" "I'm more interested in what they whisper," he replied. She drew her sword. "This ends here." He didn't flinch. "No, this is where it begins." Their fight was swift, not showy. 2 masters trading cuts, steps, breath. He bled first. She stumbled next. Then a flare. Cale's signal. The ridge ignited. Leora had poured oil through the stone cracks. A line of fire blazed across the path, cutting Cyril off. Thorn retreated. Cyril stared at the flames, at what she'd underestimated. At the movement. It wasn't just rebellion, it was memory on fire. By nightfall, they regrouped. Thorn tended his wound. Leora sharpened blades. Cale cleaned the field. They didn't speak much, but they knew. The first fire had been lit. The realm had felt it, and more would follow. Later that night, when the wind had settled and the smoke clung low, Cale stood guard while the others rested. He had seen war before. He had been a weapon in other men's stories, but this felt different. It wasn't about thrones. It wasn't about crowns. It was about voices long buried, about lives uncounted, about giving names back to the nameless, and that was worth fighting for. He sat by the edge of the dying fire, sharpening his blade. In the distance, owls called to each other like old friends. The forest did not sleep, but it held its breath. Tomorrow, he thought, they would strike again, not for victory, but for remembrance. And maybe, just maybe, the kingdom would listen before it burned. Dawn came slowly to the ravine, bleeding through the smoke like a wound that hadn't yet decided to heal. The air was thick with the scent of scorched bark and damp soil, and the ground still trembled with the echo of fire. In that half-light, Thorn stood at the edge of the blackened ridge, his cloak dusted with ash, his sword resting loosely in his hand. He had not slept, nor had Leora. She sat near the fire pit, legs crossed, sharpening a short blade with steady hands. Cale paced nearby, eyes scanning the tree line like a man waiting for a voice to call his name. No one spoke for some time, until Thorn finally broke the silence. "They'll come again, and next time, they won't just send soldiers, they'll send fear, words sharper than blades." Cale nodded. "They'll call us traitors." "They already have," Leora added. "But that's not the word that matters." Thorn turned to her. "Then what does?" She met his gaze. "Names." That single word landed like a stone in still water. Leora pulled a bundle from her satchel, parchments, sealed in wax, wrapped in oilskin. "I've been keeping records. Names of those who were erased, families burned out of registries, villages forgotten. It's not just about Ashmere, it never was." Cale leaned closer. "You've been documenting them?" "For years," she said, "since I left. Every whisper, every name carved into the side of a well or scribbled on a wall before a house was torched. If the crown wants silence, then we give them voices." Thorn took the bundle with reverence. This could shake the realm." "That's the point," Leora said. "Let them deny Ashmere, let them try, but they can't deny all of them." Cale looked thoughtful. "How do we spread it?" "Not through messengers," Thorn replied. "They'll intercept them. We need witnesses, carriers who can't be ignored." "We need to go public," Leora said. "Not in secret, not in shadow. We stand in the square and read the names." Cale frowned. "They'll kill us." "Yes," Thorn agreed, "but not before we make them listen." The next days were a blur of movement. Allies began to surface, old merchants who had once traded in Ashmere, monks who remembered sermons erased from their scrolls, even a few nobles whose titles had come from lands seized in silence. They came in pairs and trios, not with weapons, but with words and names. Stonevale became a camp again, not for war, but for truth. Bonfires were lit not for battle, but for warmth, as scribes copied each name by hand. They wrote through the night. They wrote until ink froze in the well and fingers cramped into claws, and still, they wrote. Thorn watched it all with a strange ache in his chest. He had once believed legacy was something carved into stone. Now he knew it was what survived fire. By the fourth day, word had spread. In the capital, Marilyn, no longer arbiter but not yet forgotten, received a scroll by Hawk. She read the list with trembling hands. Near the bottom was a name she hadn't heard in 20 years. Her sister. She burned nothing. Instead, she packed her things, and she rode south. Meanwhile, the king's court fumed. Advisors shouted, guards doubled, scrolls were seized, and scribes arrested. But the names had already crossed the threshold of silence, and names once spoken have a habit of multiplying. In 5 towns, children repeated them like songs. In 10 villages, elders carved them into stones. And in one city, Elendor, the names were painted across the side of the church. Ashmere, Dellen, Thorn, Leora, the night, the fire, the truth. It was no longer just rebellion, it was history fighting to exist. Kale rode ahead to scout the path to Elendor. Leora followed with the scrolls. Thorn, behind them both, carried the banner, not of a house, but of a cause. At the gates of Elendor, the guards did not move. They had read the names too, and they opened the doors. On the high square, with snow falling in thin white lines, Thorn stepped onto the old platform once used for trials. He unrolled the scroll, and he began to read. One name, then another, then 10, then 100. His voice did not shake, even when the king's soldiers arrived, even when the crossbows were raised, even when the captain barked an order. No one fired. Because one of the names Thorn read was the captain's brother, and another, their healer's wife, and another, a child who had vanished from a town no longer on maps. The scroll did what swords could not. It made them remember. It made them choose. Leora stood beside him, unarmed, unflinching. Kale stood before him, blade sheathed. The names continued, until even the snow stopped falling, and the realm, for the first time in years, listened. The silence that followed Thorn's reading was not peace, it was pressure. A moment so heavy it bent the world around it. No one moved, no one breathed. Names still hung in the air like ash, their weight doing what armies could not. And the scroll he held, stained now by wind and his own bloodied thumb, no longer felt like parchment. It felt like a sword. Elendor's square had been a place of judgment for decades. Criminals had stood here, so had rebels, so had kings, though never for long. But in that moment, as Thorn stood tall against a curtain of armored men, it was memory itself on trial, and memory would not beg. Leora stepped forward first. Her voice did not waver. These names are not just lost, they were taken. We are not here to avenge them. We are here to return them. The crowd rippled. People shifted forward. A mother clutched her son's hand tighter. A merchant removed his hat. An old priest nodded silently. Kale remained close, his eyes on the soldiers. "Hold," he said softly. Not a warning, a prayer. The captain, still frozen, lowered his hand. The crossbows followed. Thorn took one step forward. "This is not treason," he said. "This is testimony." He placed the scroll on the stone altar once used for royal proclamations, with care, as if it might still catch fire. Then he turned and left it there. He did not need to carry the names anymore. They had already been spoken. And Elendor, city of stone, city of silence, would never be quiet again. Back at the camp, they regrouped, not to retreat, but to plan. Messages flew. Runners departed. Scribes recopied the scroll by firelight. One copy would go north, one west. One would be buried beneath the ash tree, just in case. Because they all knew this wasn't the end. It was the opening. The king, meanwhile, heard the news not from a messenger, but from a crowd. Protests in the square, cries of "Name them!" outside the castle. Guards blocking the gates, not from enemies, but from the people they'd sworn to protect. Aldrin Kerwin stood at his window and saw the smoke. Not from war, from truth. His advisors spoke of suppression, his generals spoke of strategy. But Marilyn said nothing. She only placed the scroll in front of him and waited. He read, and for the first time in a decade, he looked tired. "We can't unring a bell," he whispered. "No," she replied, "but we can decide whether to answer it." In the woods, Leora dreamed of fire, not the devouring kind, the kind that illuminates. In her dream, she stood beside a child with no face, who handed her a name written on her own skin. She woke in sweat, but smiling. Thorn couldn't sleep. He walked the camp instead, past guards and watchers, past whispers and fires. He stopped at the map they'd nailed to the old oak, a crude scrawl of outposts and cities, of contacts and sympathizers. He traced the path east, where the largest cities lay, the places still untouched. "We'll need to go," he said aloud. Cale joined him. "I'll take the lead." "No," Thorn said. "You stay here. You protect her. She doesn't need protection. She deserves it anyway." Leora walked up behind them. "I'll go too." Thorn shook his head. "Not this time. You lead from here. You build the next layer. I'll carry the fire forward." Leora looked at him long and hard. "Then take this." She handed him the smallest scroll, the names of Ashmere only. "The first names," she said, "so no one forgets why we began." The next morning, Thorn rode out alone, but not empty. Behind him, the fires kept burning. Ahead, more kindling waited, and the realm, shaken now to its bones, had begun to listen. But not everyone was ready. At the southern fortress of Haldren, a garrison commander named Vale stood beside a table of maps and fumed. "How did this happen?" he barked. The room fell silent until a young officer said, "Because someone dared to speak." Vale slammed a fist down. "Then we silenced them harder." "But sir, no more whispers. We burn it down. Stonevale, Elendor, every name, every face, burn it all." And so orders were written. Torches readied, and the reckoning, now begun, would have to decide, would it run or rise? Back in the woods, Cale watched the sky change color, pale orange on the horizon, the edge of something new or something final. He stood near the fire with Leora, who held a fresh scroll. "This one's for the ones we lost today," she said. "They'll need someone to read it," Cale replied. Leora met his eyes. "We'll read it together." And they would, even if it was the last thing the kingdom ever heard. The snow fell harder that night, blanketing the valley in a quiet so thick it felt sacred. But beneath that soft cover, war was already moving. Thorn's horse cut through the frost, hooves muffled against the earth. He rode east with the scrolls tucked close, not for safety, but for proof. The air grew colder as the miles passed, and the sky took on a colorless sheen, as if it too was holding its breath. He had not slept. He dared not. Behind him, Stonevale and Elendor remained lit by flame and faith. Ahead, the cities of the Eastern Corridor waited, silent, uncertain, and likely braced for a narrative that would soon arrive before him. That a traitor rode with lies, that rebellion had returned, that names were weapons. And in Haldren, Commander Vale was preparing the match. He had not waited for royal orders. Vale believed in doctrine, not delay. The map before him was marked with red ink, lines drawn like veins through the spine of the kingdom. "Burn them," he'd said to his men. So they did. Villages near the forest were razed first, not questioned, not spared. Vale's men wore no crests, only the fire they left behind identified them. By the third village, survivors were already moving, some toward the rivers, some to Stonevale, others toward the memory of Ashmere, hoping perhaps that where truth had once burned, it might again protect. Leora heard the first report at dusk. A rider, soaked in blood and fear, stumbled into the camp, shouting the name of a town that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "Dellen's Reach," he gasped. They torched the chapel, the school, everyone who stood. Cale caught him as he fell. Leora did not wait for confirmation. She knew the pattern. It was history's echo, too loud to deny. She unrolled a new scroll, began to write. Names, children, elders. Whole lines of blood burned for being remembered. By nightfall, the camp had turned again. Not into soldiers, not rebels, but carriers, couriers, witnesses, and this time they would not wait. Cale gathered a team, 5, then 7, then 20. Runners who would carry the new list to every stronghold that hadn't yet seen smoke. They left under starlight. Leora stood by the fire, watching them go. She did not cry. She sharpened her blade. Thorn, unaware of the spreading purge black, reached the gates of Varenshold by morning. It was the last city before the coast, a port where the stories still arrived on ships faster than truth. He expected resistance. He received silence. No guard stopped him, no rider followed. But as he walked the market square, he saw why. The city was afraid, not of him, of what he carried. The scribes here had already received the first names, and they had wept. Thorn met with a magistrate at dusk. The man was old, crooked by age and guilt. "They say you speak for ghosts," the magistrate whispered. "I speak for the living who refuse to be erased," Thorn replied. The magistrate leaned forward. "Then speak louder." He gave Thorn the cathedral square. That night, Thorn read the names again. Not to crowds, but to the walls, to the statues, to the stars. The scroll grew longer as he added new ones, each written by firelight with hands that no longer shook. And in the trees beyond Varenshold, Vel's men waited. They would not strike here. Not yet. They were hunting Thorn, because his voice had become flame. Back in Stonevale, Leora received word of Thorn's speech. She smiled for the first time in days. But the smile didn't last, because the rider who brought the news had also seen Vel's scouts. "He's being tracked," the rider said. 4 squads, quiet, trained. Kale's blade was in his hand before the man finished. "I'll ride tonight," Kale said. Leora stopped him. Not alone. She chose 5. Each one had lost someone whose name now lived on scrolls. They left before the next snow. The trail to Varenshold was cold, but Kale moved fast. Memory made good fuel. And Rage kept his feet warm. They reached the outskirts in 2 days and saw the smoke. But not from Thorn, from Vel. The commander had grown impatient. His men had entered the city in silence, not as an army, but as embers. They had set the archive ablaze. The cathedral, the square, the scrolls, gone. When Kale arrived, it was ash, but Thorn stood, burned, cut, coughing, but alive. Kale fell to one knee. "We're late." Thorn looked up, eyes red. "You're just in time." Because the city had not fled, it had stayed. The names had been memorized, spoken. And when Vel's men returned the next night to finish it, they were not met by soldiers. They were met by voices, 1,000 strong, all chanting the names, all bearing torches. And for the first time, Vel's men broke. They ran, not from swords, from remembrance, from flame. And Thorn, barely standing, finally smiled. "Let the king know," he said. "This time the fire speaks back." It took less than a week for the word of Varenshold to sweep across the kingdom. Not through official edicts or trumpeted announcements, but through breathless whispers and hushed conversations. It moved like smoke, curling through city alleys and country lanes, riding the backs of traveling merchants and wandering minstrels. They carried the tale of a city that stood its ground, not with swords, but with voices. Not with armies, but with names. Thorn Avonheart. The man, they said, had walked into the fire and spoken louder than it. He remained in Varenshold for 2 days, just long enough to help rebuild what could be salvaged, to comfort the wounded and bury those who had become more than names. Some scrolls had survived, singed and torn but legible. Others existed only in the memory of those who had recited them, sung them, passed them on in whispers. Kale never left his side. The knight who had once worn the silence of the realm like armor now carried its truth like a banner. He watched over Thorn like a brother, helped distribute rations, patrolled the city streets. He did not ask what came next. He didn't need to. They were already in motion. On the 3rd day, Leora arrived. She came with a caravan of survivors, farmers, traders, displaced children, all carrying fragments of the new world they hoped to build. Some had lost homes to the fires set by Vel's troops. Others had seen family members vanish in the night. But all had one thing in common. They had heard the names, and they had come. Leora found Thorn by the ruined cathedral wall. He was writing names on a new scroll, hand trembling slightly from the cold. She didn't say anything. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder. He didn't need words to know what she meant. They were still here. That night, under a starless sky, the 3 of them met by a fire too small for comfort, but too bright to ignore. "We've stirred the nest," Kale said. "The king won't sit idle. Vel's retreat only bought us days." Thorn nodded. "Which is why we must move faster than his fear." "We need more cities," Leora added. "More places to echo. We've lit sparks, but now we need fire." Thorn spread out a new map on the ground. 3 cities circled in red. Calthus, south of the Riverlands, a crossroads of trade and rebellion. Redmarsh, to the west, once home to exiled poets and disbanded guilds. Ironmere, to the north, a city of iron and rule, quiet too long. "We divide," Thorn said. "We carry the names in different directions. If they want to silence one voice, we make 100. Kale was the first to speak. "I'll take Calthus. I know the roads. I've ridden them in armor. It's time I ride them for truth." Leora touched the western mark. "Redmarsh will listen. They were silenced before. They'll recognize the sound of resistance." Thorn's hand hovered over Ironmere. "Then I go north." Kale's brow furrowed. "That city is dangerous. They hang people for singing the wrong songs." "Then I'll read the right ones louder," Thorn replied. Leora looked between them. "When do we leave?" "Before the next frost," Thorn said. before the silence finds its courage again. They packed before dawn. Cale rode with a band of runners, fast, loyal, and angry. Each carried scrolls hidden in their boots or sewn into coats. Every one of them had buried someone. Everyone had a reason. Leora left with 3 wagons of displaced scribes. They would pose as traders, but their goods were not grain or silk. They carried paper and ink, names and dates, history carved in memory. Thorn departed alone. He took no banner, only the names of Ashmere, the city that had begun it all, and the burned edges of a scroll he had kept since Stonevale. His horse was old like him, but still steady, and together they rode north. Ironmere rose on the horizon like a scar. Black walls, steel gates, towers without flags. A city built not for welcome, but for warning. At the gate, Thorn dismounted. "I am Thorn Avonheart," he said to the guards. "I bring names." They didn't recognize him, or pretended not to, but his tone gave them pause. They allowed him in. No ceremony, no threats, just unease. That night, Thorn stood in the Ironmere Square, alone beneath the cold light of the moon. He unrolled the scroll, and he read. His voice cracked on the 3rd name. He did not stop. More people gathered. Some threw stones, one struck his shoulder. He kept reading, because silence, once broken, becomes habit. A habit Ironmere had long forgotten. By morning, he was arrested, but not silenced, because others had heard. A woman at the market recited the names as she sold bread. A boy on the wall whispered them to his sister. A priest, long dismissed from the king's chapel, began writing them again on the back of broken hymnals. In Calthus, Cale was met not with soldiers, but song. 1,000 voices had already taken up the chant. They burned no buildings, they lit lanterns, and let the names rise with the smoke. In Redmarsh, Leora found the poets waiting. The scrolls were already being copied by candlelight. One wall bore the name Ashmere in red chalk, another Stonevale. And somewhere in the royal court, a report arrived on a crisp piece of parchment. It read only, "The fire has spread." The king read it, then tore it in half, but it was too late. The kingdom had learned the names, and names once known do not die, they ignite. The palace had never been this quiet. Not when kings had died, not during plagues, not even when the northern armies had once breached the outer gates. But now it echoed with a silence so taut it felt like glass. One wrong move, one sharp sound, and it would shatter. The scrolls had reached the court, not by messenger, not by spy, but by ripple. One city, then another, and another still. Redmarsh, Calthus, Ironmere, names painted in squares, carved into walls, sung in churches and whispered in alleys. Names that had been scrubbed from history like smudges on glass, now reflecting back in firelight. King Aldrin Carwyn stood alone in the war room. A map lay sprawled before him, not a tactical one, a map of unrest, each name a flame, each scroll a matchstick. He was not a stupid man. Ruthless? Yes, but not foolish, and even he could see it now. His realm was not being invaded, it was remembering. And memory, once ignited, could not be contained. Outside the chamber, courtiers moved like ghosts, advisors whispered, generals argued, but no one acted. Not yet. Not until he gave the word. And he didn't. Because for the first time, Aldrin feared that his own silence had made the fire louder. In Ironmere, Thorn remained imprisoned, not tortured, not tried, just kept, like something dangerous or sacred. The guards rotated daily, not to prevent escape, but because too many of them began asking questions. Why is he here? What did he say? Who are the names? When answers didn't come, they started reading. The first list was found etched into a cell wall, then a second, tucked into a guard's boot. Then a third, painted across the barracks door in ash. The city could not contain it, nor could the capital. A servant girl sang the names as she cleaned the throne room. A baker gave change with a scroll. A stable boy recited them into the ear of every horse. And across the sea, even foreign ships began asking, "Who is Thorn?" In Redmarsh, Leora led marches, not riots. She stood atop ruined fountains and read until her voice cracked. She taught children how to write in the dirt, names, dates, truth. Calthus turned Cale into a legend. He became the knight of memory, the one who turned from steel to story. His followers carried scrolls under armor, blades under robes. They wore no colors, only ash smeared across their faces. At night, fires lit up the mountains. Signal beacons, truth made visible. Back in Ironmere, Thorn sat in silence until the knock, a single rap at the cell door. Then it opened. Marilyn. No longer an arbiter, no longer anything official, but somehow more powerful. She stepped in, carrying no scrolls, just a candle. "They think if they keep you in here long enough, the world will forget again," she said. Thorn smiled faintly. "They don't understand memory." "No," she agreed, "but I do." She sat across from him. "You started something, but it doesn't belong to you anymore. I never wanted it to." "Good." She stood again. "Then you'll understand why we're getting you out." He blinked. "You?" "We. The guards, the scribes, the ones who remember. You walk out at dusk. Nothing dramatic. Just a man returning to where his name still matters." That night, Thorn left his cell. No alarms, no sirens, just a nod from a young guard who whispered, "My sister's name was on the scroll." He walked into the street and the city did not erupt. It bowed, not with reverence, with recognition. They saw him, and for the first time, they didn't just see a lord, they saw themselves. He left Ironmere the next morning, and as he rode out, he saw something he hadn't expected. On the city gates, painted in red ink, one name: Thorn. Beside it, Ashmere, and below, We Remember. He rode south to meet Leora and Kale. The journey took days, but along the way he saw the signs. Children carrying scrolls like holy texts, walls etched with timelines, men and women reciting names like prayers. It wasn't rebellion, it was revolution. And it had no leader, because it didn't need one. When he arrived at the meeting point, a ridge just above the Valley of Fire, they were already waiting. Leora stepped forward, handed him a new scroll. "This one's different," she said. "How?" "It's the names of those who helped carry the names." Thorn read the first few, then stopped. "I know them," he whispered. "You should," Kale said. "They followed you." "No," Thorn said. "They followed the truth." And as they stood there, the valley below came alive with torches. Hundreds, thousands, each one held by someone who remembered, each one a silence broken. And in the capital, the king watched from his tower. He didn't speak, because he knew it was too late. The fire had learned to walk. The torches spread across the valley like stars pulled down from the sky, each one a hand lifted in remembrance, in defiance, in unity. Thorn stood between Leora and Kale on the ridge, overlooking what no longer felt like a movement, but a moment, a living pulse of names, of stories, of souls refusing to be erased. The wind carried the low hum of voices. Not chants, not war cries, just names, spoken over and over again like lullabies and battle hymns all wrapped into one. And Thorn, for all he had seen, all he had done, could not remember the last time something made his chest ache like this. He turned to Kale. "Do they know what's coming?" Kale's jaw was clenched. "They know, and they stay." Leora's eyes burned, not with fear, but with clarity. "They're not waiting for orders anymore." A scout approached from the past, dust clinging to his boots like ghosts. "They're moving. Fast. 10 regiments. At least 5 siege wagons. They've abandoned crests, nothing but black steel." Kale cursed. "Vel's been replaced." Thorn nodded. "By someone worse." Leora didn't blink. "Then we don't run." The scout looked uneasy. "We can't outfight them, not with torches and scrolls." "We don't need to," Thorn said. "We outlive them." That night, the valley became more than fire. It became plan. Messengers rode to every city that had spoken a name. Each carried 2 things, a copy of the scroll and a promise. No matter what happened in the valley, the names would not vanish. They would be carried again, painted again, sung again, because this was not about victory. It was about refusal. Refusal to forget, refusal to vanish. The next day the army arrived. Black steel gleamed beneath a gray sky. No banners, no horns, just the steady beat of boots on broken ground. Their leader rode tall and silent, his helm shaped like a wolf's snarl. Rumor called him Seric, a general with no past and no patience. He stopped at the edge of the ridge, looked up, saw fire, and did not hesitate. "Burn it," he said. The soldiers advanced. The valley, for one heartbeat, was still. Then Kale gave the signal, not a shout, a name: Ashmere. And the torches dropped, not in surrender, but in trap. Beneath the valley floor, oil-lined trenches caught flame. A wall of fire roared to life, cutting through the advance like a blade of light. Screams rose, horses reared. Confusion exploded, and from the hills, voices began to rise. Names, again and again. No arrows, no steel, just names. Seric snarled. "Suppress them." His men surged forward, but the ground beneath them shifted. Pitfalls, hidden stakes, smoke bombs crafted from old alchemist ruins, everything the realm had taught them to forget, weaponized in the hands of those who remembered. Still, the soldiers pressed on, and the silence breakers held. Thorn stood in the center, scroll in one hand, sword in the other. Not fighting. Defending. Leora ran communication between the flanks. Kale coordinated traps and fallback points. They had no command structure. They had memory. And memory moved faster than fear. By nightfall, the valley was scorched, but not lost. Sarek retreated, 2 regiments down, and nothing to show but smoke and echoes. They would come again, but something had changed. The silence had fought back, and won. In the aftermath, as ashes cooled and names were once again written into stone and soot, Thorn sat beneath the ancient ash tree brought from Ashmir's ruins. A child approached, dirt on her cheeks, scroll in her arms. She looked at him. "Can I read one?" He nodded. She did. Her voice wavered, cracked, but she kept reading, and around her the valley listened. Thorn closed his eyes, not to rest, to remember, because the storm was not over, but the spark had survived, and that was enough. For now. That evening, the leaders of the scattered movement gathered beneath canvas tents pitched in haste but brimming with resolve. Elders from Redmarsh, scholars from Kalthus, even a few soldiers from Ironmere who had deserted their posts. They all came to listen, to speak, to decide what came next. "We held," said one man, his arm in a sling, "but they'll come harder next time." "They always do," Kale replied. "But now we know we can stand." Thorn looked around the circle. "This valley, this memory, it cannot be our last line. It must be our first." Leora unrolled another scroll. "We have new names, from cities we hadn't heard from before. They're writing, they're remembering." A hush fell. Thorn stepped forward. "Then we carry this forward, not as resistance, but as reckoning." The fire flickered between them, casting long shadows. Beyond the hills, smoke still rose from Sarek's retreat, a promise not yet broken, but no longer unchallenged. And in the hearts of those gathered, a single certainty burned brighter than any torch. They would not be erased. Not now, not ever. Morning came without mercy. The sun struggled through a veil of smoke still lingering from the battle below, and the valley, though victorious, bore fresh scars. Where names had once danced in firelight, now they smoldered in soot. Yet none of the silence breakers retreated, not even the injured. Thorn rose early, long before the camp stirred. He walked the ridge alone, hand resting on the scroll case slung across his back. Every step he took stirred the ash, and with it memory. Behind him, voices had already begun compiling new names. Those lost, those joined, those still hidden in the folds of frightened cities. Kale met him at the crest. His armor was dented, stained black at the shoulders from smoke. But his eyes were sharp, ready. "They've fallen back east," Kale said. "But it won't be for long." Thorn nodded. "Then we move before they return." Kale frowned. "Where?" Thorn turned to the horizon, where the mountains of the east stabbed into sky. "We climb. We let the world see what's happening. From the highest point, we'll light a fire they cannot ignore." Kale hesitated. "You mean the Skyhorn?" "Yes. No one's lit that beacon in generations." "Then it's time." Word spread quickly. Leora, upon hearing the plan, did not object. She simply began gathering scribes, runners, and those who could carry loads uphill. There was no debate now, no strategy meeting, only purpose. By noon, they began the ascent. Hundreds strong, though quieter than any army. They moved like a tide, slow, sure impossible to hold back. Each person carried something, scrolls, torches, memories. They were not soldiers but builders of legacy. Along the way, more joined. A trio of monks from the southern ranges, a young blacksmith whose father's name had been erased, a teacher who had turned her classroom into a library of names. All walked, all climbed. The Skyhorn was not just tall, it was sacred. An ancient peak once used by kings to signal peace or war, its summit held an old brazier, long cold. But they would light it again, not for kings, for the people. At the halfway mark, they made camp. Fires dotted the slopes. Children played among boulders, repeating names as if they were rhymes. The old sat and wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition. Many had thought their stories lost forever, but now, even the mountains heard them. That night, Leora gathered the scrolls. She and Thorn sat by the fire, unrolling page after page. "These are just the ones from the western cities," she said. "There are more coming from the coast, even a few from across the sea." Thorn took a deep breath. "We started with ashes. Now we have archives." Leora smiled, faint. "The crown will not survive this. They built a kingdom on forgetting. We've taught it to remember." He nodded. But his thoughts were not on the king. They were on what came next. By the third day, they reached the summit. The Skyhorn stretched wide and bare, wind-swept and endless. The brazier stood at its center, a rusted bowl of ancient stone, blackened from a time no one remembered. Kale stood beside it, eyes narrowed against the gusts. "We'll need oil, a lot." Leora stepped forward, already prepared. Scrolls were not burned. That was never the plan. Instead, they were read aloud. Each name spoken not as a farewell, but as a foundation. Then the torches were raised. Then the fire lit, and the skyhorn, long dormant, breathed flame into sky. The column of smoke rose higher than any tower visible for miles. Ships at sea turned to watch. Cities in the distance paused their markets, and in the capital, King Aldrin stood at his window, jaw clenched. "They've lit the peak," he said. A general at his side muttered, "Then we respond." But Aldrin raised a hand. "No, not with swords, not yet." The fire meant something more. It meant the people had chosen. Back on the summit, as the blaze roared, Thorn turned to the crowd. "This is not the end," he said. "It's the signal. The flame is not for battle, it's for truth. And wherever you go, carry it, speak it. Burn nothing but silence." A roar followed, not of rage, but of resolve. Voices in unison, hundreds, thousands, they would descend the mountain, and the world would never be the same. Where smoke touched sky, change had begun, and it would not stop. The skyhorn's flame burned for 3 nights, a steady pillar of fire licking the heavens. Even when wind clawed at it and sleet tried to snuff it out, it held. The people below, scattered across forests and fields, looked up at that summit as though it were a star reborn, a light that proved their names still mattered. Thorn remained at the peak longer than anyone else. He walked its narrow paths with steps worn by memory and resolve. At night, he sat by the fire reading from the Master Scroll, not to anyone, but to the mountain itself, as if stone and sky might help carry the words farther than any messenger. On the 4th day, the summit emptied, not from defeat, but from decision. Kale and a contingent of the most trusted riders were dispatched east to the strongholds that had remained quiet. Not hostile, but silent. That silence had become more dangerous than any sword. It was time to break it. Leora led her scribes west toward the coast. She would meet with those who had kept to the shadows too long, leaders and families whose voices had been muffled by fear or bribes or both. Her mission was not to inspire. They were already inspired. Her mission was to organize, to turn memory into infrastructure. Thorn headed south, not to escape, to enter, to the gates of the capital. His journey was slow and deliberate. He stopped in every village along the way, not to lecture, to listen, to gather names. He sat by hearths, ate with farmers, wept with widows. And in every town, someone gave him something, a page, a carving, a song. By the time he reached the outer walls of Serwyn, he no longer carried a scroll. He carried a library. The king, meanwhile, had grown restless. The fire on the skyhorn had not faded in meaning, even though its smoke no longer curled into the clouds. His court had fractured, half called for force, half begged for diplomacy, and Aldrin himself had started to question which part of him still ruled, the crown or the man beneath it. When word came that Thorn approached the capital, alone, bearing no banners and escorted by no army, it caused more alarm than if he had marched with 10,000. "What does he want?" asked the Lord Chancellor. "To be heard," Marilyn said from the shadows of the council chamber. "Then he'll stand in the street like the rest of them," the general barked. But the king shook his head. "No," Aldrin said, "we listen." And so, on the steps of the outer forum in the heart of a city that had once erased its own heart, Thorn stood. He did not shout. He opened a book. He began to read. The names, not just the fallen, but the forgotten. Servants erased from record, children who vanished during purges, entire towns once redacted from maps. He read them like scripture, and the city listened. Windows opened, doors unlocked. Guards leaned on their pikes, not to block, but to hear better. By the end of the first day, hundreds had gathered. By the third, thousands. And by the 7th, the gates of the inner court opened without command. Thorn stepped through, a man of ash, now stepping into the throne's shadow. He was led to the royal chamber, not dragged, not flanked, but escorted, as though some ancient rite was being fulfilled. And there sat Aldrin. The king looked old, not in age, but in spirit, as though time had bent him. His eyes met Thorn's, and for a long moment no one spoke, until Thorn placed the book down. Aldrin stared at it. "You've come to accuse me." "No," Thorn said. "I've come to remind you." "Of what?" "Of who we are when we forget who we were." The room stayed silent. Aldrin leaned forward. "And what do you want?" "I want these names written into every hall of this court. I want the records corrected. I want Ashmere remembered, not buried. And I want you to speak them, out loud, before the realm. As a king, yes, but more importantly, as a man." The king looked down at his hands. Then, without another word, he opened the book. He read the first name, then the second. His voice wavered on the third, but he kept reading. Outside, the square fell quiet. Inside, history shifted, because the mountain had echoed and the throne had answered. For a moment, the kingdom held its breath. The king's voice trembled as he spoke the names. Some he had known, advisors who had vanished under suspicious orders, scribes who'd retired early. Others were strangers to him, but not to the people listening. Each syllable passed his lips like an ember, and everyone fell into the silence like thunder. Thorn stood still, arms crossed, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of years pressed on that chamber harder than any army could, and for once, Aldrin Serwyn looked like a man beneath the crown, haunted not by ghosts, but by the ones he'd tried to forget. The names ended, eventually, but the silence after did not. Aldrin sat back, eyes glassy, the book still open in his lap. "What do you want of me now?" he asked, voice dry as dust. Thorn took a step forward. "What you owe, not to me, to them." "And what is that?" "Truth, spoken where silence ruled, a place for their stories on the walls of this court, and a decree, binding, not whispered, that names shall never again be erased." Aldrin blinked slowly. "You want reform?" "No," Thorn said, "I want remembering." A long pause. Then, slowly, Aldrin rose. He removed his crown, not in surrender, not in defeat, in recognition. "I'll give you the court tomorrow," he said. "Call whoever you wish. Let them watch as we write what we once erased." Thorn nodded once. "Then we begin." That night, word moved faster than any horse. Not just that Thorn had spoken, but that the king had listened, that the court, long sealed in stone and blood, was opening its gates for history. In the valley, Cale sat by the edge of the watchfire, sharpening his sword but not looking at it. "It's happening," he whispered, as if afraid that saying it too loud would break the spell. Leora stood near the ash tree, arms crossed. "It's only happening because we didn't stop." She turned to the children writing in the dirt, practicing the names. And they won't either. By morning, the capital had transformed. The streets were lined with people, not protesting, not rioting, waiting, watching. When Thorn stepped into the High Court, he was not alone. Behind him came the scribes of Redmarsh, scrolls in hand, farmers from Stonevale, dirt still under their nails, orphans from Varenshold, carrying burned scraps like treasure, soldiers from Ironmere, armor unpolished, but worn with pride. And last, Cale and Leora. The high chamber filled to bursting. Ministers and nobles stood in stunned silence as the commoners entered their space, uninvited, unbowed, and unashamed. Aldrin stepped onto the dais, no crown on his head, just the book. He raised it high. "Let these names be known," he said, "and never again be forgotten." The scribes moved first. Walls once adorned with royal portraits were stripped. Blank parchment was nailed where gilded frames had hung, and the writing began. Ashmere. Dellen's Reach. The fallen, the vanished, the ones who had burned, not in war, but in silence. Leora read aloud as they worked. Cale stood watch at the door, one hand on his sword, the other on a new scroll, the next list for the next city. And Thorn stood beneath the royal seal, unmoved, until Aldrin approached. "You've undone what I built?" The king said. "No," Thorn replied. "We remembered what you buried." Aldrin exhaled. "What happens now? You listen, you step aside when needed, and you never ever forget again." Aldrin looked at the wall where his ancestors once hung, now replaced by names. "And if I do?" Thorn looked him in the eye. "Then the fire returns." That night, bonfires were lit across the kingdom, not in rebellion, but in ritual. People gathered to speak names, to sing old songs, to pass down the stories their parents had been afraid to tell. It wasn't revolution, it was rebirth. And in a small village where the first spark had once caught a field and vanished, a girl stood by a window, scroll in hand. She lit a candle, she spoke a name, and the night listened. The ink had barely dried on the court walls before the questions began. Not from the people, from those who had once held the quills. Old lords, buried in brocade and habit, whispered in corners and clutched their lineage tighter. Generals stood silent with eyes like flint, unsure whether the ground beneath them was sacred or sinking. Even some scribes, those who had written names for the firelight, now hesitated. because remembering was one thing, reckoning was another. And reckoning was coming. Thorn knew it the moment he stepped from the chamber into the courtyard, now full of statues wrapped in cloth. The silence was different now, no longer the silence of fear, but of suspense. Something was unraveling, and something else was ready to rise. Cale met him near the southern gate. "They're holding their breath," he said. Thorn didn't ask who. He knew. Leora stood not far behind, speaking with a gathering of stoneworkers and teachers. She was showing them how to chisel names into the plaza stone, not above eye level, not on a pedestal, but into the walkway. They should be underfoot, she told them, so no one walks this city without stepping on memory. Cale watched her a moment. "We've lit the fires. Now they'll want someone to keep them." "You mean rule," Thorn said flatly. "They'll call it guiding, protecting the legacy." "And if we refuse," Cale turned to him, "then someone else won't. Someone without names in their mouth, only ambition." That night, the fires across the kingdom were not celebratory. They were cautious, watchfires, guardians of something fragile. People stayed up late, speaking softly as if afraid to wake whatever power they had just stirred. Across the sea, other lands took note. Some wrote letters, some sent coin, others sent spies. The name Thorn Avonheart crossed borders it was never meant to, and in places where ash had once choked the truth, a new kind of wind began to blow. In the capital, the king did not sleep. He walked his hall barefoot, crown untouched, reading and rereading the scroll Thorn had left. Let these be written not in honor, not in guilt, but in truth. Truth that lives not on thrones, but in mouths. And outside his chambers, the guards whispered their own families' names. On the 7th day after the reading, a council was called, not by the crown, by the people, held in the very court that once buried memory. Thorn did not stand at the center, he sat in the circle. So did Leora, Cale, the scribes, the masons, the children who read. They came not to vote, but to vow, to keep the remembering, to build a hall of names, stone, fireproof, and open, to create 3 new festivals, one for the fallen, one for the fire, and one for the day the scrolls entered the palace, and to draft a pact that no name once recorded could be removed by any law, king, or blade. The pact was signed not with seal or title, but with names. Each person wrote their own, then beneath it the name of someone they'd carried, and the court wall became more than a place of memory, it became a promise. Cale, standing before it that night, ran a hand across the fresh etchings. "We did it," he said quietly. Leora shook her head. "We started it." In a farmhouse outside Redmarsh, a widow lit a candle and placed it beside her husband's name. She didn't cry, she just whispered, "They know you now." In the port of Calthus, a captain painted her sail with a name instead of a flag. In Ironmere, the coldest city in the realm, children played a new game, not king and soldier, but reader and name-bearer. And in the ruins of Ashmere, where it all began, flowers began to bloom through the cracks. No one planted them. No one needed to. Because even the ground had remembered. Thorn returned to Stonevale. The manor was quieter now, less fortress, more shrine. He didn't stay long. He walked through each room, touching stone, memory, dust. Then he went to the crypt. His father's name was there. He added his mother's. Then, with a new chisel, he carved one more. Ashmere. He stepped back and smiled. Because memory, when kept, does not haunt, it guides. That night, by a fire of his own, Thorn wrote one final name on one final scroll. Then he folded it and passed it to a child with ink-stained hands. "Take this," he said. "Keep it. Speak it. Add your own." The child nodded and ran into the night, because remembering was no longer resistance. It was inheritance. Thorn woke before the sun. He sat at the edge of the ridge where Stonevale overlooked the lowlands, now speckled with flickering lights from scattered villages. Not fires of revolt anymore, fires of memory, of nightly readings of quiet, persistent truth. The scrolls had grown heavier, not in number but in meaning. They were no longer carried by rebels, they were carried by teachers, midwives, wanderers, children. He ran a hand over his face, then pulled his cloak tighter. Even now, the wind still tasted of ash. Behind him, the manor slept, its doors no longer barred, its towers no longer guarded, and in the halls where once war was whispered, now children laughed. It had become a home again. And perhaps that was the greatest rebellion of all. Leora found him just past dawn. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. "They're planting a grove outside Ashmere," she said after a while. "Every tree gets a name." Thorn smiled faintly. Better than stones. Living roots don't crack, she replied. They spread. Cale arrived by mid-morning, riding hard from the east. Dust on his boots, a new scar over his left eyebrow. He dismounted and handed Thorn a bundle of parchment. They've ratified the pact, he said. 12 cities, 3 territories, even the outer ports. And the crown? Thorn asked. Cale smirked. Signed it yesterday, with his name and his father's. Silence fell. For once, not heavy, but full. Thorn opened the bundle slowly, reading the signatures, the marks, the scrawled initials of people who had once feared to even speak. And at the bottom, the royal seal, pressed not in gold, but red wax. No titles. Just Aldrin of Serwyn, son of Harwyn. A man, not a monarch. Thorn let the scroll fall gently to the grass. Then we've done it. No, Leora said, we've begun it, and she was right. Because remembering didn't end, it deepened. That evening, they gathered once more beneath the ash tree. No grand speeches, no flames, just stories. One by one, people rose to tell who they remembered. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stood in silence, holding the name in their heart. Cale, when it was his turn, spoke the name of a soldier he once struck down in Ashmere, one who had dropped his blade and tried to speak. I didn't listen then, he said, but I do now. Leora shared her mother's name, then her brother's, then 3 she hadn't known but had carried for others. And Thorn, he stood last. He unrolled no scroll. He said only, my name is Thorn Avonheart, I remember. It was enough. The next day, he packed quietly. Leora helped. Cale stood at the door, arms crossed. You sure? Cale asked. Thorn nodded. The flame's steady. It doesn't need me to hold it anymore. He left with nothing but a satchel of blank scrolls, a dull blade, and a walking stick. No destination, just direction. West. Toward places still silent, toward names not yet found. And every step he took, the wind carried a single phrase. Thorn had never intended to become a myth. But as he crossed into the mist-laced valleys of the Western Reach, people began to treat him like one. Children peered from behind doorways, whispers trailing him like wind. They didn't ask for stories. They told him his own. In half-formed rhymes and broken verses. He heard tales of how he turned fire into peace, how he spoke with mountains, how his sword had never once drawn blood but still defeated kings. He never corrected them. Some stories needed to be larger than the truth to survive. The land he walked now had been quiet through it all. Too far, too remote, too beaten into silence for the fire to have reached. But Thorn knew something else lived here, something older than rebellion. Forgotten grief. In one village, he asked for names. The elder shook her head. They burned them, 40 winters ago, with the schoolhouse. And no one remembered? They tried, she said. But they were punished harder for memory than for mourning. So Thorn sat, he lit no fire, he opened a blank scroll, and he waited. A boy came first, offered no words, just a stone etched with a single letter. Then a woman, a song, half remembered, a man, a button from a uniform. And slowly, line by line, Thorn began to map silence. He called them the missing lines, names half heard, stories part told, proof that even if a name faded, its echo did not. He traveled from ridge to ravine, collecting echoes. The more he wrote, the heavier his satchel grew, not in weight, in responsibility. By the time he reached the coastal cliffs of Mareth's End, the names filled 12 scrolls. He unrolled them one evening beneath the cliff's edge, letting the wind pass through them like breath, as if the sea itself might remember. It did, because the next day 3 fishermen gave him a name, then 5, then 100. Whole communities came forward, bringing fragments, fabric with initials, lullabies, etched stones hidden in hearths, and for every whisper he received, Thorn gave one back. He told them of Ashmere, of Varenshold, of Ironmere's children, of the Hall of Names. He became less a man, more a map, a cartographer of silence, but not everyone welcomed memory. In the border towns, old regimes still simmered, leaders who had profited from forgetting, who feared the return of truth more than war. One night, outside a settlement, Thorn was ambushed, not by soldiers, by those whose power depended on shadows. They burned 2 scrolls, beat him to the ground, left him with nothing but his satchel and a cracked rib. They thought he would stop. He did not. He limped to the next town, told what had been taken, and the people wept. Then they wrote, faster than ever. They filled 3 scrolls in a single week, because fire might destroy pages, but it only fed the voice. Word of the attack reached Leora. She arrived in Mareth's End 4 days later, riding hard. She found Thorn in a chapel, binding new scrolls. "You were supposed to rest," she scolded. "I am," he said, resting between names. Cale arrived the next morning. He carried new guards, volunteers, not soldiers. Each one had carried names of their own. They stayed for weeks. Together, they turned Mareth's End into a lighthouse, a beacon not just for ships, but for stories. They built a vault, stone and iron, fireproof and floodproof. Thorn named it the Archive, not of royalty, of remembrance. Before he left, the townspeople gave him a gift, a quill carved from driftwood, etched with a single word, "Keep." He tucked it into his satchel and walked inland once more, because names were still missing, and the map was not yet complete. The trail bent southward, not by choice, but by whisper. Villagers in Mareth's End spoke of a valley beyond the Black Hollow, a place where scrolls went to die. The kingdom had long denied its existence. It wasn't on maps, roads refused to lead there, and those who tried rarely came back. But silence that deep always had something to say. Thorn felt it before he saw it. The way the birds stopped singing, the way even the wind crept low as if holding its breath. The valley below was not empty, it was too full, with the weight of names unspoken, crushed into the soil like bones beneath stone. He reached the ridge after 3 days. He didn't descend right away, he sat and he listened. There were no voices, only memory. When he finally walked down, he didn't bring a torch, he brought ink. Each step marked a name, whether spoken or not. Every broken fence, every blackened tree, every ruin was a record. It just hadn't been read yet. He set camp near what remained of a church, only its arch still stood, the rest reclaimed by vine and rot. By the dying light, he wrote, not new names, lost ones. Words passed to him in fragments, a song sung by a madman, a name etched into a seashell, a lullaby hummed by a woman too afraid to say her son was ever born. He called it the Inkwell, this silent church. For 6 days he worked, and on the 7th the enemy returned. Not the army, the architects of silence. They wore no uniform, but their voices were sharp, their boots clean. They carried no swords, but each held a ledger, empty, ready to overwrite. They demanded his scrolls, he refused, they lit a fire and tried to burn him again. But this time they were not alone. A scout from Mareth had followed Thorn's path. When the fire rose, he rode. Behind him came 10 more. By nightfall, the enemy fled, not beaten by force, but by truth arriving faster than they could erase. Leora arrived 2 days later. She didn't speak. She just took Thorn's burnt hands and began copying what remained. Word spread. The Inkwell was not a grave, it was a forge. And out of it came new names, new oaths. Cale arrived with supplies, guards, a banner, not of color but of names. They raised it high over the arch, and on the day the valley was officially named, it wasn't Thorn who spoke. It was the children, reading names not theirs, but kept. And for the first time in decades, the kingdom wrote a new place into its map, the Inkwell. A site of fire and remembrance, where ink stood taller than any blade. The wind that once carried smoke now carried stories. From the Inkwell to the coastlines, across highland paths and forgotten villages, names spread like pollen, settling on everything, rooting into memory. They filled market squares, scrolled along church beams, crept into school books. Even the shadows started to whisper them. It was no longer just remembrance, it was culture. And Thorn watched it grow. He remained in the valley weeks after the fires had cooled, not as a leader, not as a legend, just a man with ink-stained fingers and a satchel always too full. New arrivals trickled in daily, riders from the eastern borders, midwives from salt towns, even a cloaked noble whose father's name had been purged during the early rain. Each came with their own fragments, some brought, others brought questions. How do we protect them? Thorn had no single answer, only a truth. You speak them, every day. They built more than walls. They built ritual. Every morning began with a name, every meal ended with one. Children learned to write not by copying monarchs, but by etching family lines, some still full, others lost, and slowly rediscovered. Cale started a militia, not to fight, but to defend. Their armor bore no crest, only the etched initials of someone remembered. They trained daily, but swore no oaths to the crown, only to the truth. Leora crafted a curriculum. She created a system where names were recorded not by officials, but by communities. No central vault, no single source. Distributed memory, carried like fire. It was dangerous and brilliant, because no tyrant could erase them all. The crown, surprisingly, did not retaliate. King Aldrin remained in Caerwyn, quieter, older, His letters to Thorn were brief but honest. He had created something built on silence, and now he listened. His latest decree declared the inkwell sacred ground. Royal patrols were forbidden. No noble could claim title within 3 miles of its boundary. But power doesn't vanish just because it's humbled. One night, a messenger came bleeding into the valley. A smaller city, Braylon, had refused the memory pact. Its council had burned the public scrolls, arrested 3 elders who read names aloud, claimed the movement invited chaos. Thorn sat in the circle of firelight, scroll in his lap. "We go," Leora said. Kale agreed. Not to fight, to speak. By dawn, 30 riders left the inkwell. They carried no weapons, only words. When they reached Braylon, the gates were locked, but the people were watching, and when Kale spoke a single name, an old merchant known in the region, the crowd began to murmur. When Leora read from a scroll in the square, guards hesitated, and when Thorn stepped forward and offered a blank parchment to the crowd asking, "Who else remembers?" a woman stepped out, then a child, then 20 more. By nightfall, the council fled, and Braylon became a beacon. Thorn didn't stay. He left the parchment behind, blank still, because the people had already started writing. He returned to the inkwell to find something unexpected: foreign dignitaries, 2 from across the sea, 1 from the desert kingdoms, not sent by their kings but by their people. "We heard about the names," one said. "We have lost our own." Leora welcomed them. She translated the pact into 3 new languages. Kale taught them the rituals. Thorn shared the scrolls, and one morning under a quiet sky, the dignitaries etched new names into the western wall, in a tongue the valley had never heard before. It didn't matter. Every name is understood when it's spoken with grief. Years passed. The inkwell became more than legend. It became pilgrimage. And in the heart of that valley, Thorn continued to write. He didn't lead, he walked. One path at a time, toward silence, toward names, toward whatever memory had yet to be kept. It began with a whisper, then came the wind. A girl from Braylon walked into a market in Serwyn and unfolded a scroll. She spoke the names, not loudly, but clearly. 2 guards paused, 1 wept. Within an hour, 5 more scrolls were unfurled. Within a day, the square was filled, and then they marched. Not with swords, with scrolls, thousands of them. Every city that had once remained silent sent someone. The inkwell led the way. Farmers and poets, elders and orphans, tailors and blacksmiths. They came in lines, not ranks. They carried memory like armor. Some scrolls fluttered in the wind, others were worn like cloaks. The path to the capital, once feared, now glowed with footsteps and parchment. Thorn didn't lead them. He walked somewhere in the middle, quiet, steady, listening. He saw old friends among the crowd, scribes who had once doubted, children who had grown up with the names. He saw banners painted with fireless torches, symbols of voices now lit. He heard chants, not of defiance, but of remembrance. Whole families reciting the names of generations that had nearly disappeared. By the time they reached the walls of Serwyn, the king was already waiting. Aldrin stood atop the balcony, not with guards, not with fanfare, just with a single scroll in hand. He did not stop them. He opened the gates. The scrolls entered the capital and changed it. Every plaza became a page, every alley an archive. The High Court, once the throne of silence, became a hall of voices. Children read names beneath royal banners. Priests sang oaths once forbidden. A woman from the sea read a list that took 6 hours. No one interrupted. Even the king listened, especially the king. He stood beside Thorn in the great square. "This city has a new crown now," he said. Thorn nodded. "It weighs less, but it burns more." They walked together through the capital, Aldrin bareheaded, Thorn flanked by those who had carried the names across mountains, valleys, and borders. They did not issue decrees, they did not announce laws, they simply pointed to the names. By sunset, the scrolls had filled every wall, and yet no ink faded, because every name had found its place. At nightfall, a great fire was lit, not for war but for warmth. Around it, the people gathered. They did not sing anthems, they shared stories, short ones, long ones, unfinished ones. All were welcome. And the day ended not with a cheer, but with a silence so deep it became sacred. A silence full of memory, of stories spoken, then kept, of a world that had once tried to forget and finally learned to remember. That night, Thorn wrote one final name in the city, Hope, and he let the ink dry on stone. The city didn't return to silence. It resonated. After the scrolls marched through Serwyn, something had shifted, not just in policy, not just in the palace, but in the way people breathed. They walked differently now, lighter maybe, or with more weight, but chosen weight. Memory made them stand straighter, and Thorn stayed long enough to watch it take root. For weeks after the march, the capital became a center of stories. Wandering minstrels changed their tunes to name ballads. Merchants began wrapping their goods in scroll scraps. Testimonies inked on fabric traded like gold. Cafes set aside chairs marked with names, a place to rest for those no longer with them. It was beautiful. It was fragile. Because when something sacred grows too fast, there are always those who wish to twist it. At the edge of the northern border, an old noble house began rebranding itself. Not with bloodlines, but with adopted scrolls. They claimed memory, but doctored it. Spoke the names, but only the ones that served them. It was the first corruption. Thorn heard of it in whispers. Scribes brought back altered copies, edited names, histories rewritten in ornate ink. He left the capital the next day. He didn't go alone. Kale rode beside him. Leora followed with a new group of record keepers. They returned to the inkwell with urgency, not dread. They knew what had to be done. If names could be changed, then the truth had to be protected. They built something new beneath the valley. A vault, yes, but not for locking memory away, for preserving its shape. It took 30 days and 100 hands, stone from Ashmere, timber from Red Marsh, tiles painted in the old Ironmere style. Every part of the archive bore memory. At the center stood a single chair, not a throne, a desk, a seat for the first archivist, not a ruler, a keeper. They asked Thorn to sit. He declined. He handed the quill to a young girl from Braylon, the same one who had read first in the Caerwyn market. Memory belongs to those who carry it forward, he said. She took the chair, and the oath began. Let no name be stolen, let no scroll be altered, let no silence replace truth. It echoed beyond the chamber. It echoed through the years, because in a kingdom that once forgot, the greatest power now lay in remembering, and those who remembered were no longer alone. They were the archive, and Thorn at last walked beyond the walls toward the mountains, where silence still waited and names still whispered, because the work was not done and he was not yet finished. Thorn did not leave the archive with fanfare. He left at dawn, his pack light, his eyes steady. The mountains beyond the inkwell had always loomed like a last chapter, pages yet unturned, stories unspoken. Most said there was nothing beyond them but wind and ruin. Thorn knew better. He had seen maps in whispers, mentions in burned scrolls, names spoken only once and never again. What lay beyond wasn't emptiness, it was the deepest silence. And where there is silence, there is forgetting, so he walked. Through pine-thick ridges and frozen ridgelines, across rivers so still they mirrored stars. He met no one, but felt watched, by history, by shadow, by the hush of things too long buried. Then, after 7 days, he reached it. A city of stone, or what had once been a city. Now it was ruined, not burned, not collapsed, just vanished, as if it had exhaled its own name and disappeared. But names don't vanish, they wait. He stepped through broken arches, past statues eroded to facelessness. He did not try to rebuild, he recorded every carving, every mark. He opened a new scroll, the longest he'd ever carried. And he began to write. For 3 days he wrote. Then the wind changed. Footsteps, not soldiers, others, travelers, exiles, scribes who had heard of his path and followed. A healer, a baker, a widow with her grandson, a boy with a flute. They didn't ask if they could stay, they simply began helping. Some cleared rubble, some copied fragments. One, an artist, sketched the ruined temple's ceiling and began repainting it, each color tied to a name. Thorn wrote them all, not because they were lost, but because they had chosen to remember where memory dared not tread. By the end of the week, the city had a name again, Ashfell. It wasn't its original name, but it was honest. Because from ash, echoes had returned, and from echoes, a voice. Ashfell did not become a beacon overnight. It became something rarer, sacred and hidden, a city not built to be seen, but to be felt. Every wall bore a name, not engraved in metal, but in pigment and ash. Each stone was chosen for the way it sounded when knocked, as if to ensure the walls could carry voices, not just hold weight. The people of Ashfell didn't speak loudly, they spoke carefully. Every word was weighed. Stories were told by firesides, written into community books, not because they were new, but because they were necessary. One night, Thorn sat beneath a half-fallen pillar. The stars blinked above him, and in the silence he could hear the breath of the city, soft, sure, growing. Leora sat beside him, returned from the inkwell with news. "The archive thrives," she said. "Children carry names now the way they used to carry bread." "And here?" Thorn asked. She smiled. "They carry stone." Cale returned 2 days later. He had ridden from the coast. His blade was still sharp, but his voice softer. "They're asking for a council," he said, "not a throne, a place where memory and governance meet." Thorn nodded. "Then it's time." The first council of Ashfell was held not in a hall, but in the ruins of the old theater. They sat on stone blocks beneath open sky and passed no laws, only questions. How do we protect memory? What do we do when names are weaponized? How do we honor truth and still forgive? There were no quick answers, only echoes. But they listened, and that was enough. The flame in Thorn's heart didn't burn like before. It smoldered, warm and slow. It had become something else, legacy, perhaps, or simply peace. He walked the paths daily, not to guard, to witness. He read stories carved in benches, listened to songs hummed under breath, helped a child find the right word to finish her father's name. And one morning, he woke to find the entire square filled with paper birds, each folded from a name, each one placed by someone he hadn't seen arrive. He stood in the center and watched the wind lift them, carry them, scatter them like memory, refusing to be still. And he knew then, Ashfell wasn't the end of the road. It was the voice at the end of a long silence, answering back. The winds of Ashfell carried more than stories now. They carried questions. In the months that followed the founding of Ashfell, the once-forgotten ruins grew into a living archive of memory. What had started with a name, carved from ash and echo, began to shape a new way of being. But not everyone who arrived came to remember. Some came to control. A scholar from the western coast brought scrolls filled with half-truths and disputed claims. He said his purpose was to complete the record. Others nodded. Thorn watched. Another, once a royal clerk, suggested that names be ranked, ordered by influence, alphabetized by value. It started again, the old hierarchy wearing a new face. Thorn called a meeting in the center of Ashfell, not in anger, but in warning. He stood on the same stones where the paper birds had danced in the wind. "The archive is not an altar," he said. "It is a mirror. We don't polish it. We reflect in it." The people nodded, some reluctantly, but they understood. Ashfell adapted. New guidelines were drawn, not laws, but vows. Every name was recorded exactly as given. Every story kept in its speaker's tongue. Every visitor asked not for proof, but presence. Memory was not a hierarchy. It was a gathering. Then, one night, the sky over Ashfell lit up with fire. Smoke from the north. Thorn stood beside Cale and Leora on the edge of the ridge. A city they hadn't yet reached was burning, not from rebellion, but from refusal. Refusal to remember. They rode at dawn. The road was long, the wind bitter, and still they pressed forward. When they arrived, there was nothing left but ash and silence. The buildings had collapsed inward, not from explosion, but abandonment. The kind of ruin that doesn't shout, it just vanishes. But even silence has survivors. A boy, no older than 10, stood in the wreckage. He held a single scroll wrapped in cloth. "My mother's," he said. "She wrote it before the fire." Thorn knelt before him. "May I read it?" The boy nodded, and under a broken sky, Thorn read aloud, names, one by one, until the smoke no longer choked, until memory filled the air. Others joined them, quietly, slowly. A merchant with ash on her coat, a teacher clutching a charred ledger, a weaver who had saved a tapestry of initials sewn into wool. They did not ask what to do. They simply began again. And Thorn helped. He did not lead. He listened. He copied the names. He inked them on stone, on wood, on skin if needed. He walked with them until their silence broke into story. They named the place Emberest, not in mourning, in recognition. Because what remains after flame is not always ruin. Sometimes it is the beginning. Back in Ashfell, word spread. The archive sent volunteers. Leora crafted a new binding system, interlinked scrolls, coded by the region and resistance. Cale brought fresh scouts, ones trained not just in blade but in biography, and then something unexpected happened. Cities began requesting scrolls, not to erase, but to replicate. Schools, courts, temples, places that had once silenced were now seeking memory. Ashfell became a hub not of rebellion, but of resonance. The ink ran forward. And Thorn, ever the traveler, ever the recorder, continued walking, one scroll at a time, because names once spoken do not sleep. They stir, they build, and they carry the world on their breath. They called them the wind scribes, young, old, quiet, bold, travelers who didn't carry swords but scrolls, who didn't ride for conquest but for remembrance. They spread from Ashfell and Emberest, moving through villages, hamlets, hidden valleys, not to change the world, just to name it. By the third year of the archive's founding, Thorn saw what he had once hoped for become something much greater than himself. Names flowed like rivers now, recorded on parchment, and as chiseled into stone, sung into the morning. What began with whispers now filled amphitheaters, classrooms, marketplaces. Ashfell had become more than a refuge. It was the memory engine of the realm. People arrived not just to remember the lost, but to contribute, to leave names, to carry names, to become part of a story that no longer belonged to a crown or to war, but to everyone. And still, resistance lingered. In the far northeast, a citadel rose. It bore no flag, only silence. A place where scrolls were outlawed, names forbidden, stories punished. They said memory made people weak. That silence made them obedient, and those who defied it disappeared. The wind scribes who ventured too close never returned, until one did. A girl named Rhea. She arrived in Ashfell barefoot, bleeding, clutching a torn fragment of a scroll hidden in the lining of her coat. Her hair was matted with soot, her clothes ripped from briars. She spoke little, but her eyes, those told the entire tale. They're building erasure, she said. Not just forgetting, a machine for it. Thorn listened in silence, then stood. We've carried names through fire, through ash, through ruin. Now we carry them through silence. Leora and Kale joined him. So did Rhea. They didn't form an army. They formed a procession, 100 scribes, each with ink, voice, and memory. As they marched north, word spread. Town by town, outpost by outpost, they gathered others, those who remembered, those who had been silenced, those who had never dared speak a name aloud. When they reached the foot of the citadel, it stood unmoved, a tower of steel and gray stone with no windows and no doors. But silence like stone can crack. They didn't knock, they didn't shout, they recited. Each name, lost, banned, buried, spoken aloud again and again. The scribes stood day and night. Some fainted, some wept, but they kept reading. The ink ran down their hands, smudging into skin. And then it happened. A creak, a groan, a door cracked open, and from inside a voice. My name is, then silence again. But it was enough, because when one name escapes, the rest follow. The citadel fell not with fire, but with breath. And when the wind carried those names back across the hills, they weren't whispers anymore. They were a roar. Because ink is not just for writing, it's for waking. And the wind scribes had become the kingdom's voice. A voice that could not be silenced. A voice still writing. When the citadel of silence finally fell, it did not collapse in ruin. It unraveled. The stone didn't break, it breathed. Doors opened not with force, but with recognition. Those inside didn't flee. They stepped out, blinking into the sun, scrolls pressed to their chests like they'd never left them. It was the last stronghold, the final bastion of forgetting. And it yielded, not to violence, but to voice. The wind scribes, exhausted and hoarse, didn't celebrate. They rested, then they wrote. Because what came next mattered more than victory. What came next had to last. They turned the citadel into a sanctuary. Not just another archive, but a school, a refuge, a forge for the future. Thorn named it Hearthmere, the place where breath and memory meet. In Hearthmere's great hall, names were no longer just remembered, they were taught. Children learned their first letters by writing stories, not from books, but from the voices of elders who had once been afraid to speak. Every scroll copied, every fragment repaired, every tongue spoken. Languages long thought extinct began to return. A woman from the Sea Isles taught her people's chants again. A man from the Broken Hill clan spoke names aloud he'd never dared whisper, not even to himself. And as the fire of remembrance spread, a new question emerged. What do we do with power now that it remembers? Councils formed, not of kings but of keepers. The Archive, Ashfell, Emberest, and now Hearthmere each sent scribes. Leora chaired the first summit. Kale ensured security not with weapons but with ritual. Rhea trained the next generation of wind scribes. Thorn watched from a distance. He no longer needed to walk every path. He had become part of the landscape itself. And one morning, with sun breaking across the scroll-lined ridges of Hearthmere, Thorn passed his satchel to a girl with steady hands. "Your name?" he asked. She smiled. "Doesn't matter yet," she said, "but I'll carry yours." And he nodded, because the ink still ran forward, because the kingdom now remembered, and it always would. Years passed. The roads between Ashfell, Emberest, Hearthmere, and the archive no longer needed guards. They needed guides. Children walked them to learn the names. Elders walked them to remember the ones they'd lost. Travelers came not to conquer, but to listen. In the heart of Ashfell, beneath the oldest tree that had grown since the day Thorn arrived, a bench was carved with his name. Not as monument, as marker. "Here sat the listener," it read. Thorn had aged, not into weakness, but into stillness. His steps slowed, his voice grew softer, but his eyes, they still read every scroll that crossed his table. He no longer needed to wander. The names came to him now. With every season, more scrolls arrived, from new cities, from distant lands, some written in languages Thorn could not read, but he didn't need to. He could feel the shape of memory inside them. One afternoon, as autumn painted the mountains in rust and gold, Leora visited. She carried no scroll, just silence. They sat together beneath the tree. "It's done," she said. "No," Thorn replied. "It's begun," she smiled. "The children say you're the first name they learn," he chuckled. "Then they're already remembering wrong." But he didn't stop her. That evening, Kale joined them. The three of them sat as the sun dropped below the valley rim, casting the archive's glass roof in gold. They didn't speak of wars, they spoke of words, of names that had shaped rivers carved into rock lit in fire. They shared stories, not of battle, but of those first nights by the inkwell, the march on Serwyn, the day the wind scribes found their voices. Each moment they recounted was another name etched softly into the dusk, and just before nightfall, Thorn reached into his satchel one last time. He pulled out a scroll, blank. He passed it to the girl from Hearthmere, now grown, now ready. "This one's for the names not yet spoken," he said. She nodded and took it. She unrolled it slowly, feeling the weight of history on the empty page. She looked at Thorn, not to ask what to write, but to acknowledge what had been written already. Then, without ceremony, Thorn leaned back. He closed his eyes. The wind carried his name, but it didn't echo. It folded quietly into every scroll that followed. Because remembering wasn't about monuments. It was about momentum. In the days that followed, a new grove was planted near the tree, each sapling named for a scribe, for a speaker, for a keeper of names. The children added Thorn's name to the roots, not at the top, at the bottom, foundation, not finish. And the girl with the scroll? She kept writing, one line, then another, not to replace Thorn's legacy, but to continue it, because the last scroll was never about endings. It was always about what comes next. If this story spoke to you, if you felt the wind shift when Thorn passed the last scroll or heard your own name whispered in the silence, then I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell us what moment stayed with you. Was it a city reborn, a name remembered, or perhaps just the quiet courage of carrying on? Your words matter. They're part of the archive now. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to Chronicles for sleep. This isn't the end of the story, just the close of one scroll. Tomorrow, we turn the page together. A new legend, a new name, another ember glowing in the dark, waiting for a voice. Hit the like button if you'd carry Thorn's satchel. Share this video if you believe memory is a kind of magic. And join us next time as we unfold another tale, one more bedtime story stitched with shadows, stars, and the stubborn pulse of history. Until then, rest well, remember freely, and may your dreams tonight carry echoes of names worth keeping. Good night, traveler. We'll meet again soon.